I'm the director of the University of Cambridge Center for Gender Studies. Welcome to the final Race Talk seminar, Transatlantic Dialogues, a symposium on race, imprisonment, and transformative justice, done in collaboration with Oxford Intersectional Humanities. On behalf of the co-founders, Carrie McInerney, Ola Osman, as well as the Center for Gender Studies, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who've contributed to these seminars over the past few years, making the Race Talk seminar a vibrant site for discussion about the co-constitution of race and gender, with speakers and audiences from around Cambridge and around the world. We'd also like to thank all of the sponsors that have made this event possible: the Judith Wilson Fund for Small Grants Award, Cambridge University Center for Gender Studies, Mansfield Queen Estate, St. Catherine's College, MCR, Cambridge Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, and the Center for Human Rights and Governance. In the wake of many troubling events of violence over the past few years, along with the insurgent forms of public resistance that have ensued in response to legal and extra-legal violence visited on Black communities in the US and the UK and further abroad, calls to abolish the prison system and the police, we are urgently being compelled to reimagine and reorient our approach to equality, justice, and the pursuit of freedom. Equally as important, Cambridge University is currently facing a critical moment in coming to terms with its historical connections to the transatlantic slave trade, specifically in investigations within colleges and the university about donations from benefactors of the trade that have contributed to institutional financial stability. While each context is unique, both are related to the histories and ongoing presence of violent anti-Blackness. This transnational symposium aims to examine the legacies of racial slavery in both the UK and the United States through the prism of mass incarceration. This symposium is organized and led by one of our nearly completed PhD students, Ola Osman, who is a Gates Scholar and whose research maps the continuities between transatlantic slavery, its attendant racial logics, and the relation to the role of ethnicity played in the Liberian Civil War. So thank you so much for all of your hard work on this amazing event, Ola, and for your work organizing the Race Talk seminar series for several years now, which has been a wonderful series of challenging and illuminating conversations with some absolutely fabulous speakers. And I'd like to bring up Ola now to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you for that, Lauren. I'm really excited to have everybody here. So I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Malik and Nasir. Malik is an author, poet, and academic from Liverpool. His memoirs, Letters to Gil, is a compelling account of his childhood experiences in a brutal UK local authority care system, which at 18 left him traumatized, semi-literate, homeless, and destitute. A chance meeting with poet and activist Gil Scott Heron was to prove life-changing, setting him on a path to success. Malik is currently reading for a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge on a full ESRC scholarship, and he's recently been awarded the prestigious Sidney Smith Memorial Prize for outstanding achievement at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, as well as the Vice Chancellor's Award for Global Impact. So, Malik, come on up.
Thank you all. Can you guys hear me at the back? Yeah. So I just want to thank the Centre for Gender Studies for putting on this event here today, and particularly to thank Ola for inviting me to participate in this, and Malcolm as well for flying over to grace us with his experience and his knowledge on the subject matter too. So my name is Malik Nasir, so I'm currently at St. Catherine's College doing my PhD in history. And the PhD that I'm doing is around looking at kinship networks and how those kinship networks were founded on the transatlantic slave trade, and those mercantile networks, how they continue to have impact to this very day in many of the institutions that we know of, including this institution as well. So Ola mentioned, and the lady from the Gender Studies mentioned also about the historic inquiry into enslavement here at Cambridge, and there's some students here today, Tiger and Toyin, who did the Newnham College inquiry, and they actually discovered the early benefactors of Newnham College, which was founded here as the first college for women, were in fact from a company known as Sandbach Tinian Company, who were the family, the kinship network that enslaved my actual ancestors. We're not talking anecdotally here. My actual ancestors, I am a direct descendant of them and their slaves in Demerara, in what was formerly British Guyana. So my PhD study is looking at this firm, Sandbach Tinian, namesake of Samuel Sandbach and Philip Frederick Tinney, two of the most prolific enslavers in Britain, to give you an idea of the extent of the power and the influence of these guys. Samuel Sandbach in 1831 was mayor of Liverpool. He was also the founder of the Bank of Liverpool. Liverpool at that time was the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade. And he and his family were in control of Liverpool. And many of the institutions that came out of Liverpool, they founded the Royal Institution, which went on to become the University of Liverpool. They founded the Mechanics Institute, which went on to become Liverpool John Moores University. They founded the Liverpool Athenaeum, which is still there to this day. I'm now a proprietor member myself because I needed to get access to their archives, and that was the only way to do it, it's a private archive. So my studies have been as a direct consequence of being cut off from my history, from my past, from my cultural heritage, to the legacy of having been a descendant of those who were enslaved by these people who had founded these prestigious institutions that many of you still enjoy to this very day. And it was this lack of cultural identity that propelled me to come here to Cambridge and to really try and find a way to put our identity back on the map. So I started off as a poet, and I'm going to recite for you a little poem about what it is to have your identity stolen and then to try and reassert it. It's called Black and Tan. What would you call me if I told you what I am? A human man of black and tan. Black is my heritage, active and line. Tan is my skin color, starved of sunshine. Starved in a world where the sun rarely shines. Robbed is my heritage, tanned is my hide. Tanned is my hide every time I rise up and question the thieves that my heritage took. Starved of a future, a world without war. Starved of a chance to make good by the law. What would you call me if I said to you that you were responsible for all that I did? If I did a murder or drugs or made war, would you give me medals my country adored? Would you give me power to kill and to steal? Would you let me make laws to guard such ideals? I think not somehow, though ironic it is, that you do for you all these things to do with a power you stole from my African land, abused and misused like my people through time. By you and your laws made for keeping us down and tanning our hides because our skin colour is brown. I want you to know, tan enough is my skin, and one day will return, like our culture will win. So, why did I write poetry? I wrote poetry not to be a poet. I have no interest in being a poet. I wrote poetry to try and become literate, because as the descendant of a family who had directly been involved in enslaving people and being enslaved by those people in Demerara and British Guyana, I've been completely and utterly cut off from that root where my father, who was born in 1918, who grew up cutting cane on sugar plantation in Demerara, East. When he came to this country in the 1930s, we completely lost all semblance of where we came from. And prior to that, his connections to Africa would have been cut off through the process of removing his name, removing their identity, removing their culture, their religion, and everything when they were enslaved by Samuel Sandbach and Philip Frederick Tinney when they shipped them from Africa and brought them to the plantations of Demerara in South America. So as a consequence of this, my father comes during before World War II, to England and starts to work as an agency for the British as a colonial seaman. During World War II, he signs up for the Royal Navy, fights the Nazis. After the war, he settles and has his kids. My mum is white, so I've got a black father and a white mother. My father was much older than my mum, like 30 years age difference, and he died when I was very young. But just before he died, he had a stroke, and he became quadriplegic. He was paralysed from the neck downwards, so he went into hospital. So social services came. And at this point, we lived in a poor white neighbourhood, because like many of the black seamen, my father had bought a house because you couldn't rent a house if you were black. They used to have signs in the window, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs in Britain. So you couldn't rent a house. So the seamen bought their houses. So my father bought his house. But then, as the governments do, they came in and did what's called a compulsory purchase order. In America, they would call it eminent domain, where they come in and say, we need your land for some purposes, and they take your land, and they used it to disperse black communities. In the post-slavery era in America, they would go in and find some very vibrant black communities that had grown up, and they basically go in and they say, no, we need to put a railroad through here, and we're going to flood it and build a dam and put a lake, and they would just put the black communities under the lake, or they would just knock them down and you know, move everyone out and resituate them somewhere else and take them from being homeowners and make them to tenants. So constantly they were being knocked back economically generation after generation. The same thing happened here. So all the black people who lived around the port in Toxteth and Liverpool had their houses compulsory purchased, and then they were sent out to white areas. We went to a white area with 100,000 white families and 4 black families. I thought nigger was my name. Okay? In school assemblies, the story of little black Sambo in the jungle. Black Sambo in the jungle. Hello, except big black mumble, big black jungle. This is being played in school assembly. 5-year-old kids sitting there listening to this, and the headmaster was playing this on the reel. And they were like, Black Sambo, point your voice. And they were fighting. And then I was expelled from school at the age of 9. And the social workers come along and tell me, you've got 4 black kids. Why don't you give us your black kids? Yeah? Find yourself a nice black man and have a proper family. This is what social services are telling me. So my mum fights them as much as she can. Eventually they take me and my brother. So at the age of 9, I'm taken into local authority care. My reception into care in 1975 was to be taken to the Liverpool Children's and Mission Union, a place called Wood, to a big old house that was gifted to the council by a sugar baron, okay, who comes from a family that had previously owned slaves. And this house in the city council that had been converted into this so-called children's home had an isolation room. And in the isolation room, they had rooms with bars on the windows, and I was placed in that room with those bars on the windows at the age of 9 and locked in solitary confinement for 2 weeks. And that was my reception into local authority care from the Liverpool City Council. No one would talk to me. My meals were pushed under the door. Someone would come and take the plate. Nobody would speak to me. I had no idea why I was there. I didn't know where I was going home. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what the outcome was going to be for me. And then I got marched into a courtroom in juvenile court, and I heard 3 Latin words which changed my life forever. In loco parentis, in lieu of the parent. And this is a regulatory mechanism by which the freedom of an individual is removed by the state. And that freedom, that parental right that is automatic, that is God-given, is removed from the parent and vested with the state. How did that come about? The moment that happened, my mother was no longer responsible for me. The state would say whether I went to school, whether I didn't go to school, where I went, where I didn't go, where I lived, where I didn't live, if I saw my family, if I didn't see my family, whether I was in or out. All of this was determined by the state. My mother had no say in that at all for the whole rest of my childhood, from 9 to 18. And these people moved me from one brutal, traumatic experience to another, telling me, oh, you're just going to be here for 1 night. Then it was 6 weeks, then it was 6 months. Then 4.5 years later, I'm like, I'm not ready to go to war with these guys. Because they're just not going to let me out. In the end, I kind of did go to war with them, and they threw me out. But by that time, I'd spent 4.5 years working on a farm, digging trenches the size of a football field, hand digging these trenches to plant potatoes, and they sold the potatoes. We were being used as child slave labor by Liverpool City Council Social Services. They decided they wanted to grow tomatoes, so they needed to build greenhouses. So there was probably a stretch, maybe about 4 times the length of this room, the width of this room, where we had to dig the trench. We dug the trench out, and we put these railway sleepers around the side, and then they brought dumper trucks with hardcore from the building sites, you know, all the bricks from demolition, and they dumped it into this, like truck after truckload of this stuff. And then they gave all the kids, they gave us these little hammers, and we had to smash the bricks down into gravel, like little pieces like this. Smashing bricks into gravel. Children, okay? And then raking the gravel so they could create the foundation for the concrete, so they could then build the greenhouses so they could grow the tomatoes, which they sold. I'm doing this when I'm supposed to be in school. Other kids are worrying about math. I wasn't doing math. They had some kind of classrooms on the premises, you know, where an 18-year-old and a 9-year-old could be in the same room, and they didn't really teach you much because you didn't have no milestones. They didn't expect nothing of you. You didn't, you know, you weren't going to sit any qualifications. You were persona non grata. You were off the grid. Nobody was looking to see whether you made any progress. So at the age of 18, they finish. They just like, you know, okay, you're 18 now. Your care order is over. You're free. They dumped me in a hostel for homeless black youths in post-riot Toxteth in Liverpool. I was semi-literate. I could barely read and write any more than I was when I was 9 years old when I came in there. I was traumatized for all the experiences that I had to go through. I didn't know my family anymore because even though I visited them from time to time, we grew up apart. I was completely separated from my siblings, you know. We were never even in the same institution. My mother and I couldn't talk about it anymore because we were like, you know, it was just too traumatic to even raise the issue. So it went unsaid. And then at 18 years old, I wandered backstage at a concert in Liverpool at the Royal Court Theatre, and I got to meet the artist and civil rights activist known as Gil Scott-Heron. Many of you will know him as the person who wrote the poem, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." So I wrote a little reprise to "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And this is more akin to what I'm doing with my activism right now. So this is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Mobilized." The revolution will not be mobilized until our agenda has been politicized. Our people have become individualized whilst our dreams of unity have vaporized right before our eyes. How come we couldn't realize that the man took the freedom we exercised and emasculated our brothers through homicides and sexualized our sisters with the Real Housewives just because it was televised? Where is the spirit the king theorized, or the war against oppression Malcolm verbalized, or the unity that Mandela symbolized? Who will feed the world now Live Aid lived and died, no matter how hard they tried? The debts of 23 nations Bono excised, yet still the third world is ostracized, and Joni Mitchell showed how they paved paradise. When are they going to realize, like Mayor Angelou said, and still I rise? Martin Luther King Day was realized when Stevie Wonder and Gil Scott-Heron vocalized, turning hatred to love was rationalized, but whilst they're on tour, John Lennon dies right before their eyes. WikiLeaks was penalized for telling truth, debunking lies our governments had falsified to twist our minds and blind our eyes so we could never organize. The world right now is terrorized by a narcissist who theorized that through hatred he could realize the power that he did so desire, though the consequences were dire. Hate will never retire till it gets thrown in the fire. The revolution will not be mobilized, politicized, individualized, or theorized. The revolution will be right before your eyes. The revolution will be live. Thank you. So this is kind of where I'm at now. It's like, had it not been for Gil Scott-Heron taking pity on me, he had no duty of care to me. He was not my father, although he behaved like a father to me. You know, he was not even from my country. He wasn't responsible for me. But he'd come from, he was born in Chicago, but he'd grown up down south during the Jim Crow era. He was one of them kids that was bused to school. You know, they had that Brown versus Board of Education ruling in America. So after Brown versus Board of Education, they said the black kids had to go into the white schools. But because the black kids didn't live in the white neighborhoods, they bust them in. So he was one of them kids that was bust in, and the KKK were burning crosses on the lawns, and the National Guard had to be brought in to protect the little girl with their school books trying to get into school because, you know, white people wanted to kill them for, like, daring to come into their neighborhoods and their schools. He was one of those kids. But he'd grown up down south with his grandmother, and his grandmother was old school. come from that sort of, sharecropping kind of, place down in Jackson, Tennessee. And she had inculcated values in him, and one of the values was, if you could help someone, why wouldn't you? This is a simple principle. If you could help someone, why wouldn't you? And it was on the basis of that that he helped me. And he managed to transform my life from this semi-literate, feral, traumatized street kid to the person that stands before you now, who, having graduated from all 3 of Liverpool's universities, is now reading for a PhD right here. Thank you. So this is where I'm going to make a shameless plug for my book. This is called Letters to Gil, and this tells my story of the 27 years that I spent being mentored by Gil Scott-Heron. And Gil died in 2010, and when he died, 2011. When he died, I was approached by The Guardian and asked if I would tell my story. It was kind of a backstory, because obviously everyone knew Gil. He was world famous. In 2010 we did a world tour. I was with him on that tour. But he died and they didn't have a narrative, and they were kind of like, he's had a bit of a hard time, and in his latter years he went to prison. I went to the States and visited him in prison. He was at a detention facility in Watertown, which is up by the border with Canada, upstate New York. And it was terrible for me to go in there and see him. Like, I was asked what I thought about seeing him in prison, and it was like looking at a lion in a cage. The majesty of the lion is still there, but he's in a cage. And I talk about that a little bit in the book as well, because people were saying to me, oh yeah, but Gilly had some problems towards the end of his life with drugs, and then he went to prison and da-da. But I'm like, if he'd have judged me when he met me, he would have left me where he found me. But what he saw in me was the potential of what I could be. And it was because of that non-judgmental attitude towards me that I was able to become the person that I am. And the work that I'm doing now is helping others. So I mentor a lot of young people. I've also got a bill going through Parliament at the moment called the Widening Access and Participation Bill. It's had its first reading in the House of Lords, and hopefully if it passes, it will make an amendment to the Higher Education Research Act of 2017 to make it more equitable for black people to enter institutions like this. I fought to get into this institution because, as you all know, anyone who's here, you need a first-class honours degree. If you're going to do a PhD, you need a master's with distinction. You need to show your alma mater needs to be a Russell Group university. I went to Liverpool Hope. At that time, it wasn't even recognised as a university. It was an institute of higher education. It didn't have university status. It was a backdoor route, because I couldn't get into mainstream universities, because at 18 I couldn't read. I came out of there with a 2.2. I didn't get a first-class honours degree, because of the intersectional disadvantages that I'd faced and where my starting point was. But when I did my slavery research, and people saw the seminal nature of that research, I came here, and Julie Coimbra here with us today, who was the librarian at the School of Latin American Studies, and Julie had heard about my research, and she invited me to present it. And when I presented it here, people found out about it, and my supervisor, Hank Gonzalez, was like, this is major research, this needs to be here. And he had to fight to get me in here. But even when I applied to come here, they threw my application in the bin. And he went down to the admin office and said, where's this application, Malik al-Nasir? This is really important research. He said, oh, it's in the bin. Because they looked at the top copy. Alma mater, Hope University. It's not a Russell Group university. Yeah? Grade 2.2. It's not a first-class honours. Masters, well, he got a master's from John Moores University, also not Russell Group. But, that's the equivalent to the Ivy League. Bottom line is, he got reasonable grades, but it wasn't a distinction. So therefore, no, bin. And he was like, no, take it out of the bin. And he took it out the bin, and since I've been here, I've raised £250,000 for my projects. We've got 2 policy documents called Barriers to Black Academia, Slavery, Colonialism, and the Case for Reparative Justice, and lifting the barriers to black academia through positive action and decolonisation. Both of those will be launched in Parliament early in the spring. And we're going on tour of the UK with a team of academics that worked with me on those documents to promote them to senior leadership teams to open up the opportunity for black people in mainstream, and particularly selective British universities to create ring-fence funds for them to get positive action training programs, and also initiatives once they come in to give them funding. And with that and the bill through Parliament and also my research on Sam Betts-Tinney, we've just had a conference in Bristol. Some of the guys here today presented at that conference. I raised 120 grand for that conference. We put that conference on. It's a 2-day conference, and we'll be producing a whole range of things out of that as well, including curating a series of exhibits that will run both in the UK and the US using some of the existing technology and some future tech that's being developed by Bristol Digital Futures Institute, who hosted it. So I've been able to add value as a student, but I would never have had that opportunity if I'd have been judged by my childhood. And that childhood was completely and entirely controlled by the state, and the state failed me in every single way possible. And this guy, with one simple act of kindness, changed all of that. So big up Gil Scott-Heron. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. Okay, so I'm really excited about this panel that I put together, featuring Malcolm Mays, Chelsea Jackson, and Adam Elliot-Cooper. And also, Raphael Rowe is in the room, so can we get a round of applause for him? Okay, so Malcolm Mays, born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, Malcolm Mays is a modern-day Renaissance man, recognized for his filmmaking at an early age. With his first film premiering at the Prelude Film Festival, Mays has continued to pursue a multifaceted career as an actor, writer, filmmaker, and philanthropist. Recently featured in The Hollywood Reporter as the next big thing, the multi-talented artist has successfully maneuvered through an often tragic cycle of gang violence and transformed his experience into personal and professional triumph. Known for his starring roles in the award-winning series Snowfall, Them, Covenant, and Raising Kanan, Mays has also appeared in the acclaimed films Southpaw, Life of a King, and The Day Shall Come. He has also written several studio films, including New Jack City 2 for Warner Bros., Ferguson, the Michael Brown story, also Warner Bros., Steal Away, Robert Small's biopic for Amazon, Inseparable for Imagine, Nike, and the LeBron Lego sports movie for Universal. As a member of a socially stratified community, Mays has made it a priority to give back. Once at-risk youth, he works closely with Unusual Suspects Theater Company, a nonprofit organization that brings after-school theater workshops to at-risk middle schoolers and high schoolers at educational facilities and juvenile detention centers in Los Angeles. Mays was honored for his work with the organization at their annual gala alongside Tiffany Haddish. So can we get a round of applause for Malcolm Mays? Adam Elliot-Cooper is a lecturer in the School of Politics and IR, Queen Mary University of London. Elliot-Cooper is the author of The Black Resistance to British Policing and Empire's Endgame, Racism in the British States. That came out in 2021, short and sweet, that's his bio, so can we get a round of applause for him? And last but not least, Chelsea A. Jackson. The Equity Architect is a political scientist, scholar, activist, TEDx speaker, and founder of Equity Architecture, which helps organizations to walk the talk by leveraging the power of social justice. Part of the feminist collective Cradle Community, co-author of Brick by Brick, How We Build a World Without Prisons, with a career stretching across higher ed, the nonprofit charity sector, marketing, and consulting, Chelsea managed the $30 million Global Racial Equity Program at WPP until 2022, where she worked on projects including the Cannes Festival of Creativity, Black Equity Organization, Gizmology, and dozens of global racial equity programs. A Rhodes and Harry Truman Scholar, she holds 3 master's degrees, political science and African American studies from Emory University, criminology and criminal justice, in public policy from the University of Oxford, a peer-reviewed academic. Her research in racial and ethnic politics has been presented at the American Political Science Association and the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Co-founder of an Atlanta student group in 2014, Chelsea has organized with Black Lives Matter, ATL, DC, Law for Black Lives, DC, Mothers for Justice, Ubuntu, Cradle Community, and Oxford Mutual Aid. And she has spent the past 10 plus years working in the intersections of social change and racial justice. Can we get a round of applause? And I'm actually gonna ask all three of you to come on up. While you guys get set up here, we're gonna also do a tea break downstairs, and Jenny will lead folks downstairs. So Jenny is over here. Can you give everybody a hand? So you can go downstairs for tea, 10 minutes, and please be back so we can start our panel. Yeah. Can we get everybody to sit down? We're ready to start. Okay, so our next speaker needs no introduction. Raphael Rowe, I am handing it over to you.
Thank you very much. And, I'd like to thank the organizers and the sponsors for giving me this opportunity to speak today. And although it said that I don't need any introduction, some of you might not know who I am. So let me be clear. My name is Raphael Rowe, and I'm an investigative journalist and TV documentary maker. Changing the narrative is what I try to do in my work. I was the first person of color with dreadlocks and a prison background to report for the prestigious 6 o'clock news on the BBC, the Radio 4 Today program, and the world's longest running investigative current affairs TV program, Panorama, who are celebrating their 70 years of existence today. Interestingly, I was watching the ad that they put on the BBC, and I wasn't in it, so I was really frustrated with that last night, given the history and the doors that I opened as a person, and the very first person with dreadlocks, brown skin, prison background, couldn't speak Queen's English to be working on these prestigious programs. So I'm disappointed that they didn't nod to that, because it did open doors for many people who looked, sounded like me, who embarked on their careers as journalists. Currently, I present a popular series on Netflix called Inside the World's Toughest Prisons. I host my own podcast called Second Chance, which, as the title suggests, I talk to people about their second chances in life, not just those who come out of prison, but people who have been disabled by a trauma or something where they've embraced or have been given a second chance. I'm also the founder of the Raphael Rowe Foundation, a charity, and I'm a recent criminology graduate. I did criminology. I didn't go to university until I was in my late 40s and came away with a distinction in criminology quite recently. I don't know how I'm going to put it to use because I already do.
Let's get there.
I'm very proud because I use that to inspire people who I go and visit in prison to let them know that they can use their time constructively. When I was 20 years old, I should say, many of you won't be surprised to hear that my journey to becoming an investigative journalist and TV documentary maker was driven by my experience with social and racial injustice. When I was 20 years old, the British police arrested me and the criminal justice system convicted me and 2 other young black men for a murder and a series of robberies that we didn't commit. Despite the victims describing the perpetrators as 2 white men and 1 black man, 3 black men were convicted. And one of the white men was described as having blue eyes and fair hair at the trial by the victims. I had dreadlocks at the time, my co-defendant had dreadlocks at the time, and my third co-defendant was very dark-skinned, yet we were still convicted. The trial judge was not sympathetic and described the evidence that proved our innocence, i.e. the victims' descriptions, as a mystery, and that the victims must have been mistaken. I was sentenced to life imprisonment, destined never to be released. I was a Category A prisoner and held inside maximum security prisons here in the United Kingdom, up and down the country. I was young, I was 20, I was volatile, I was angry, I was bitter. And so I reacted to the system and suffered as a consequence. It took the European Court of Human Rights to demand that the British Appeal Court reopen my case, or our case, and acknowledge that we didn't receive a fair trial. The identification issue was just one element of the case. My conviction was finally overturned and I was released after spending 12 years in prison. So from the age of 20 to the age of 32, I spent all of my 20s, every day of my 20s, inside maximum security prisons, and it was tough. But while I'm not here to focus on my wrongful convictions and imprisonment today, I wanted to give you the context in terms of the work that I do. But if you're interested in learning more about my fight for justice and the racist brutality that I suffered and witnessed in prison, you can read my autobiography, plug, plug. And it's called Notorious, but it's the not I that is the clever bit. And it's available on all the book outlets, or you can get it directly from my website at raphael-rowe.com. And connect with me on Instagram if you want to find out more. But through my work on the Netflix series, Inside the World's Toughest Prisons, I've documented the realities of prison life and uncovered similarities and differences between prison systems globally. And if you haven't watched the show, basically, I spend 7 days inside some of the world's most dangerous prisons. I immerse myself as a prisoner. I take on the persona as a prisoner and immerse myself in that environment for 7 days, living with the prisoners, sleeping with the prisoners, and engaging in conversations and learning more about the systems within those prisons. And so as someone who's experienced life behind bars, I have a perspective, obviously, on the challenges faced by prisoners around the world, which is the reason that I've been invited here to talk today. And despite the cultural and systemic differences, I found that prisons share common problems, and we know this, such as overcrowding, violence, and limited resources, which contribute to the poor living conditions for people in prison and also the people that work in these prisons. And it perpetrates corruption, especially in some of the places that I've been to. And these findings underscore the critical need for global prison reform to better serve society, prevent victims, because that's what it's supposed to be about, the purpose of prison. But I advocate one prison at a time is the key to success. And I say this because the current implementation of wide sweeping policies is difficult to implement, which is why we constantly keep knocking on these doors, trying to change policies that has no direct impact on people that are working in prison, but more importantly, serving prison sentences. And so it's the constraint of an already overburdened system that you cannot change, in my view, based on the prisons that I've been to and have spoken about. And it goes without saying, yet we say it again and again, how essential it is to establish fair and unbiased legal systems to prevent wrongful convictions like the one I experienced. Providing people serving prison sentences with access to healthcare, education, job training programs is also crucial to their successful reintegration into society. We know that. It didn't work for me. My opportunity to become a journalist was a chance encounter, and this is how it happened. I came out of prison after spending 12 years in prison. I spoke the prison slang. I couldn't speak English. I come from South London, so I had my South London accent entwined within the prison slang. And yet I found myself at the back of the BBC studio at the old television centre, where the then editor of the Radio 4 Today programme, a maverick guy called Rod Liddell, was standing having a cigarette, and we struck up a conversation, or at least he did, and I tried to articulate who I was, even though he knew who I was because of the profile of my wrongful conviction. And he offered me a job, an opportunity to work for the Today programme there and then. And it changed the trajectory of my life. As Malik said about meeting someone, being given that opportunity. One guy, one white guy, thank you, one white guy who was a maverick, and some people would describe today as a racist, gave me the opportunity to become a journalist for the Today programme. Of course, Rod Liddell was exploiting this brown boy with dreadlocks because Greg Dyke, the then director of the BBC, was calling for the BBC to change. It was hideously white.
Right, yeah.
Okay, and I was the remnant. But what did I do? I became, as I said earlier, the first person with dreadlocks to report on the 6 o'clock news. You haven't seen it since. The first person with dreadlocks to be strutting my stuff on the Today programme, and then Panorama, doing stuff that I wanted to do. And it's all been a project for me about changing that narrative about what somebody can become given that opportunity. When I go into the prisons that I visit in my Netflix show, I have no agenda, I have no judgment, and I meet some of the most hideous criminals you can imagine to meet, from serial killers to serial rapists to murderers to people who commit crimes for economical reasons. And they do come in all different colours, shapes and sizes, given the countries that I go to. Addressing things like overcrowding and poor living conditions is, for me, a necessity to promote the safety and the well-being of people in prison, including, as I say, those who work in prison. Restorative justice programs that focus on rehabilitation and reintegration into society can save lives. In my season 7 of my Netflix show, I went to Finland prison, and I spent 7 days with Finnish prisoners, and there were 2 guys in particular who I spent time with. One was covered in tattoos. I mean, they're very masculine, macho-type guys, and one was covered in tattoos. But he had a good persona about him, although his crime was kidnapping and torture. You knew that it was driven by his society. And we talked. And I spent 7 days with this guy. The program went out. He was released, and within 3 or 4 days of his release, he was shot dead. He was shot dead because the father of the son and the son who he kidnapped and tortured had confrontation with him, and they shot him dead. The father got off. The son is now serving 6 years. The mum contacted me recently and said that she'd rather her son be in prison than dead. And I share that story because at the end of that particular episode, I spoke to the director, as I do in every institution, about what more could be done to help what you do in this prison to avoid the violence that many of these prisoners will continue to go out and perpetrate because there is very little restorative justice or rehabilitation in that prison. And he did say to me, restorative justice. And it made me think, if only they had a restorative justice in that prison where that young guy could have met the family of the people that he committed crimes with, to have, I say a conversation, but it requires a lot more than that. But it may have prevented another young man going to prison for the murder of another young man who committed a horrendous crime. Restorative justice, for me, then, is really, really important. I have had the opportunity to film inside prisons around the world, from the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Colombia, South Africa, Brazil, Bosnia, Lesotho, Belize, and many, many more. And the insights gained highlight the need for systemic change and more compassion in the approach to imprisonment, to incarceration. These experiences have exposed me to significant differences in how various cultures and systems approach incarceration or imprisonment, with some prioritizing rehabilitation and others focusing on punishment and retribution. I don't have a particular stance, although I think people go to prison for punishment. They don't deserve to be punished whilst they're in prison. In places like Norway and Greenland and Cyprus, where I've also filmed my series, the emphasis is on rehabilitation, providing people serving sentences, and I use that term carefully, people serving sentences, with education, job training and counselling services to help them reintegrate back successfully into society after their release, because only then will it prevent the next victim. Whereas on the other hand, countries that favour punishment often have harsher prison conditions and longer sentences. Even those even for those who didn't commit a crime. And here in the UK, many of you will know there are concerns about the criminalisation and imprisonment of misunderstood young black men, particularly through the guilty by association, joint enterprise and affiliation laws. And I get approached on a daily basis as a former miscarriage of justice victim from the mums, brothers, sisters, and individuals themselves who complain of being given a 30-year sentence for a crime that they weren't even present at. So they didn't inflict the wound that killed the person. They were not present when the crime was convicted and committed, and yet they're serving 30 years in prison. And I don't think, if I'm honest, and I've been in many, many prisons, I don't think I've ever met a white guy who is suffering the same as the many, many young black guys who have been convicted of these crimes. And it is frightening. Different cultures have varying attitudes towards crime and punishments, I've discovered, in many of these countries, and that's evident. While some prioritize forgiveness and reconciliation, others view severe punishment as the necessary aim for maintaining social order. Now, despite these cultural and systemic differences, it's crucial, in my view, to approach imprisonment with a focus on justice and fairness. All individuals, regardless of their background or circumstances, deserve to be treated with respect and dignity whilst they're in prison. They should have access to the resources that help them reintegrate successfully back into society. It's a no-brainer, in my view. But the current approach to imprisonment in the UK has resulted in high rates of reoffending among individuals who are released from prison. We hear it all the time. Billions of pounds are spent in this country on what they term rehabilitation, but I've seen it not happening in prisons. And the current lock 'em up and throw away the key method is inadequate, as we know. A more just and impartial system is required. And to break the cycle of reoffending, a rehabilitative approach should be adopted, in my view, to focus on addressing the underlying issues that lead to criminal behaviour, and they vary, as we know, and we've heard from Malik, and we will hear from others. Implementing education and job training programs to assist individuals in acquiring new skills, which can increase their chances of finding employment on release, is, again, a no-brainer. And a lot of work is being done in these directions. I just don't think it's as genuine as it could be. Mental health and addiction treatment to address the underlying issues that contribute to the crimes that some people commit. I was watching, I don't know why I'm watching it, but I watched this thing on Channel 4 last night called Banged Up, and there was a journalist from the Daily Mail who I've had a couple of twos and fro's with on live TV, Peter Hitchens, who doesn't believe in addiction. And there he was saying he doesn't believe in addiction to a group of guys who have committed crime because of their addictions. And yet he doesn't believe. And he is the voice of the British establishment. He is the voice that politicians listen to. He is the voice that says people need to be treated harshly in prison. But for me, it's about creating opportunities like the one I was given in that moment that I met that editor of the Today programme, for community services as well. Projects and programmes like that can make a difference. Volunteering to help individuals feel connected to their communities and develop a sense of purpose. So prioritising rehabilitation over punishment and sentencing is, for me, what's important. Adopting a more equitable and just approach to criminal justice can help individuals successfully reintegrate. And there's also, for me, what I've discovered in my Netflix series is the interaction between prisoners and prison officers, and how crucial that role is in the success of a prison system. Treating the individual in custody with professionalism, respect and compassion is essential, despite the many labels that are given to prisoners, inmates, criminals, lowlifes, offenders, felons, convicts, and cons. It's vital to remember that these are individuals, they are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect rather than being dehumanized, because when, like I was, dehumanized in prison, beaten black and blue, brutalized constantly on a daily basis. I reacted like an animal. Honest to God, the person you see in front of you today was not the person that spent 12 years in prison. I was a violent, reactive, emotionless, dehumanized individual who spent months and months and months in isolation and segregation, sometimes stripped naked in a cold cell, which is a concrete slab, for days on end. Blood dried on my body. And it was on one occasion during that brutality that things changed. I was in Wormwood Scrubs, a prison in London. I'd been taken to the segregation block because I refused to go to work. I shouldn't have been in prison, so I refused to conform to the regime. On this occasion, the Scrubs prison officers decided that they were going to drag me to the isolation block, beat me black and blue, strip me naked. What they didn't realize is the next day, I was having a visit from my QC, who was helping fight my wrongful conviction. So where they tried to get me to wash the blood and bruises, if they can be washed off of my skin, and I refused, I went onto that visit with my QC, who saw the blood and bruises from that beating. He was able to then report it, and a significant thing happened. The squad, as we used to know in Wormwood Scrubs, was broken down. It was broken up. Legal action was taken. I was compensated. Numerous other prisoners were compensated because of that explosion. It was just a chance moment, again, where my lawyers saw what I suffered. So by treating prisoners with empathy, compassion, and respect, prison staff can foster an environment of mutual trust and respect. And this can have a positive impact on rehabilitation and help reduce reoffending rates. It can mitigate some of the negative effects of the prison system, such as the development of violent and aggressive behavior, like the person that I became. When it comes to making changes in any system, it can be difficult to determine the best course of action, of course. While some may argue for complete abolition, others may advocate for incremental reform. In my experience, I've found that making changes within the current system's limitations can be a practical and effective way to enact meaningful change. By taking steps to address specific issues and work towards achievable goals, we can create positive momentum and inspire further progress. At the same time, we should remain open to the possibility of more radical reforms if they are necessary to achieve greater justice and equity. Ultimately, it's up to all of us to work together to find the best path forward. Now, I would like to say thank you and end. But what I will say is we can turn our negatives into positives. That's exactly what I did. I have always been in control of my own destiny, even when I was contained and I couldn't make decisions, even when I lost the ability to reach for a handle and open a door because I'd been conditioned by the prison system. Think about that. People who go to prison for years lose the ability to do the things that come natural. For me, I couldn't open a door when I left prison. I couldn't hug. I couldn't hug the female that loved me. I couldn't sleep in a bed with a person that loved me because I'd been conditioned in a single cell, in a single bed, without a handle on the inside. The one good thing prison gave me is the ability to shop. Because you can't make decisions about what you have or don't have in prison, I'm like a kid in a sweet shop, even now, 30 years after being in prison, because the choice is so much. Prison damages anybody that's been to prison or knows someone that's been to prison, damages you physically and psychologically. It, in my view, squares your thought process. It squares your brain because you are confined in a square space for such lengths of time. But thankfully, there are people like myself, you people sat beside me, who can inspire those that we've left behind. to change their way of thinking, to make them believe that there can be a life after imprisonment or incarceration. And that's really important. And finally, I have never, ever, in all the work that I've done, forgotten about the victims. I know that there are victims as a consequence of crimes that people commit, but it's not about the crime. It's about humanity. It's the way we treat people who are less fortunate than us or have come from marginalized communities or trauma backgrounds that we must remember. Thank you.
So, since Raphael is leaving, do you have maybe 5 minutes for any Q&A?
I've got 25 minutes, actually.
Yes, 25 minutes for Q&A. All right, so do we have any questions for Raphael? We'll do about 10 minutes and then go into our other panel.
Before we do, can I say just thank you, man? I think I speak for everybody in the audience and who's not here. Thank you. I found myself getting very emotional as you were speaking, because a lot of the truths you were speaking are very intimate for me. And I don't know if people understand what you lose, what incarceration takes, what the true cost is, what the real opportunity cost of losing your humanity is. Because when you said you couldn't open the door, I was like, shit, that was like most of my fucking... I have like real family people who've known me through that process. And I don't want to be the actor crying on stage, because that's not what this is about, but not, waiting to go to the restroom, like waiting to be told, waiting for everybody else in the room or your significant other to use the restroom, as if that's a trigger or an alert to go, and you just lose so much humanity. And I think that both for the victims and the people who have committed the crime, or for the legal system that kind of flattens us and flattens our humanity, that is, I think, the true root and issue. And I don't understand how you have become who you are. Truly, I don't understand how Malik has become who he is. I don't know how I became who I am. But there's a brotherhood here that I just want to say thank you. And please, please, like, keep gifting. Before anybody asks any questions, I just want you to know it's a gift, truly.
Thank you. I should just say that for me, I mentioned how bitter and twisted and angry I was as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, 23, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30-year-old in prison, all those years that I was in prison, 31, 32. But it was this moment, on the day that my conviction was quashed, and I walked down the steps of the Court of Appeal, and they opened a door for me for the very last time. On the other side of that door was my family, my mum, my dad, and my 3 sisters.
Amen.
One of my sisters in particular was my rock. And when I fell into her arms and cried for the first time in those 12 years, that anger, that bitterness, that twisted Raphael left me. It was as if every tear that dropped from my eyes and my family's eyes dissipated that bitter, twisted individual. And I promised myself, not consciously, but I promised myself I would not be the bitter, twisted, angry man that they want me to be from this moment on. I become a successful journalist and share other people's stories and give a voice to what I believe is the voiceless communities.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.
Thank you. Okay, let's open it up for any questions for Raphael. All right, I'll start here in the front with Malik, and then we'll go back there.
So Raphael, like the power dynamic that you describe, which is kind of evident in the inability to do a simple task like open a door. Sorry, the power dynamic that you describe, which is inherent in the simple task of opening a door, and having that taken away from you as one sort of aspect of your humanity, just that simple thing in and of itself, what does it tell us about the power that's being exercised over you and the people who have been vested with that power? What does that say? Because, you know, we're all equal as human beings, technically or supposedly. How do we get to a state where there's one person or one entity that has the absolute control and power and you yourself are now in a situation where you're not even allowed to open your own door. Like, how do you describe that power dynamic?
I think you hit it when you talk about control. It is about controlling our destiny, and they do that in many different ways. And losing the ability to do anything for yourself and being dependent on someone else. We see stories today about prisoners having access to PlayStations and whatnot in prisons, and for some reason people believe that alleviates the fact that they've lost their freedom. Losing your freedom is the ultimate punishment. I didn't have a toilet. In all the years that I was in prison, there was no toilet in myself. I peed and pooed in a chamber pot and had to wait until they opened my door to go and slop that out. I had no TV in the cell. I mean, I did the harshest, toughest imprisonment. And I'm not saying it's any easier having a TV in your cell or having a toilet, but at least you can poo when you want to poo, right? And you can pee when you want to pee, and you can brush your teeth and wash your face. I was dependent on being let out of my cell to fill the bowl. So it's about control. And I advocate that you need to take control of your own destiny, even when somebody is dictating the pace at which you move. And I did that by not allowing them to make me do the things I didn't want to do. Yes, I couldn't open a door. I couldn't pee and poo when I wanted to pee and poo. I couldn't get out of prison until the authorities made the decision that my convictions were unsafe and unjust and my convictions were overturned. But the moment that I was wrongly convicted, I didn't succumb to losing hope. Hearing other people's experiences is how I acronym HOPE. Hearing other people's experiences is part of hope. And for me, it was that deep hope inside that allowed me to keep control of who I was to become. So it is about keeping control of what you can keep control of, and don't worry about the things that you can't control, because they're beyond your control.
All right, so we have a question here, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you for that. How long did it take for you to come back to you? Do you know what I mean? How long did it,
I didn't come back to me. I become a different person. I become a more educated person, a more determined person, a more focused person, a more... I lost the me that my mum and dad brought into the world, the me that comes from a culture that was a mixed culture. My dad's Jamaican, my mum's English. I grew up in London. The environment that I grew up in, I never went back to. The friends that I had, even though they weren't the greatest friends, they were my friends. They were people who knew me, knew of me. But I think I never came back, and I know that because I have 3 sisters, and I was their 20-year-old brother when I went to prison. I was a 32-year-old man when I came out, and I was never the same person again. And our relationships could never be like they were when we were kids growing up, and we were very close because my trajectory changed. Our relationship changed. My dad found it really difficult to bond with me. My mum found a different person. So the honest answer is I never came back. I developed new skills and ways of existing, and they are much better than the ones I had before, admittedly. But I did turn those negatives into positives.
I think what I mean is, when you wake up someplace when you're not familiar with and you don't remember, what I mean is, how long did it take for you to just not have that haunting you? Or does it still?
It still haunts. It still haunts. I'm here talking about it right now, so it brings me back into I can see myself as a 20-year-old. I can see myself in the first prison that I was in, and I wasn't just in a prison, I was in a prison within a prison. When I first went into prison as a 20-year-old man, I was not in a prison. I was in a prison, but there was a prison built within the prison that I was held in as an A-category prisoner. There was only 20 of us in there. Everybody else was grown men, and I was a vulnerable 20-year-old who had to become violent to survive, and that's what I become. So it never leaves you. The emotional and psychological scars that developed throughout the years that I was in prison, and anybody else that's been to prison will know, you can draw on them to make you a stronger person, but they never, ever leave you. And you may ask the question, why the hell do you go back into prisons and make documentaries about life in prison? I suppose it's a draw, and it's a way of trying to educate people about the fact that people are not who you think. I was called a monster. The national newspapers in this country called for hanging to be brought back. I would have been executed had the Daily Mail and the Sun and the News of the World got their way. Me and my co-defendants, who were innocent, would have been executed had they got their way. I was not the monster that they demonized me to be. And so I tried to share that by going into prisons and making other people realize that people are not what they think they are.
Do we want to come over here, actually?
Who was first?
Here, and then
Here?
go up there.
Hi. Sorry, I didn't see.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for your talk. It was really powerful. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the usefulness of crime as a category to understand the sort of harm and the phenomena around, people doing other harm to other people. And from that, the category of criminals and victims. So I'm thinking of it specifically in if we're trying to do sort of restorative justice work and also talking to people within the system who use those categories of crime, criminals, and victims, how useful is it to still be using those categories, even if we may think that the way that the category of crime that has been constructed is sort of relying on some, deeply racist ideas about why people do the things that they do. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on
I don't know if I know the answer to that, but what I think immediately is that those that commit crime have had crimes committed against them. And it might be deprivation, it might be marginalization, it might be racism, and that is what drives some of their behavior because of where they come from. And we overlook that far too often. We look at the victim who, rightly so, we look at the victim who has suffered as a consequence of that individual committing a violent crime or an economical crime against that person. But we tend to forget sometimes that the people that are perpetrating those crimes, or like the guys I talked about earlier on who are being criminalized even though they've not committed a crime, they may be in a culture that is gang-related. It may be that they're not quite the people that the media often want to portray them to be. They're our brothers, they're our sisters, they're our friends, they're kids who were not born criminals. They developed a necessity to feed themselves. And we're talking about all different types of criminals. We're not talking about a particular cohort. So for me, it really is about criminals are victims. Victims are a consequence of those who have had crimes, but of a different nature committed against them. As I say, economical crimes, deprivation, growing up in marginalized communities where there's no investment into developing opportunities for them to be educated. Because for me, once I learned how to read and write in prison, I could read before I went to prison, I could write before I went to prison, but I mean really read and write and articulate myself so I could stand in front of people and argue with them with words rather than my fist. That changed. I mean, it took quite a few years, but once I learned, it made all the difference.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to ask what your opinion is on prison abolition. And then the reason I ask is you went through a really terrible experience and you've spoken about the conditions of prison and how to improve them. But we know that the prison industrial complex emerges, right, with intention for reasons that have nothing to do with harm or crime, and we know the place that the carceral system plays in an anti-Black world, right? So, what's your opinion on prison abolition, and what do we do with the fact that prisons don't emerge because of harm to others, but as a racist political strategy to remove certain categories of people from the world, and for neoliberal capitalism?
I think that's true of the United States. I think there are elements here in the United Kingdom. But I've in the last 4 years, visited 30 different prisons around the world that contain white, black, Asian, various cultures and nationalities. And the same can't be said of, this kind of capitalist prison system in Finland or in Cyprus or in the Czech Republic, because you're dealing with a different culture, different types of criminals. I think when I stand in these prisons among the cohort of prisoners, I do struggle sometimes to think, what else could they do with you? What else and where else could they put someone like you who's killed 30 people? You intentionally went out and killed 30 people because you are a serial killer. Mental hospital, a hospital where they address. And so I've really struggled. I think I used to believe that abolishing prison was the answer, that it shouldn't exist. But then there's a bit of me that kind of thinks, what do you replace it with? Correct. There could be institutions that you could replace prison with, but I don't know what that would look like. I also, I've looked at the restorative justice, the harm element, and does that work? I think in some circumstances it does, but in other circumstances it don't. Could I forgive the people who sent me to prison for 12 years? Not in a million years. I would never forgive them for putting me through what I went through, putting my family through what they went through. So I struggle with abolition, but I do believe that you can change systems, prison systems, one at a time. I'm not an advocate that one policy will make a sweeping change to the cohort of prisons here in the United Kingdom. I think one at a time, you improve those conditions for the individuals that are housed in those prisons.
We'll go back there and then we'll do another question up here.
Hi, thank you for sharing your story with us. My first question is, have you thought about what your life might have been like if you hadn't gone to prison?
Who knows? I was destined to become a criminal. I think my destiny, because of the environment I was growing up in, was crime, criminality, drugs. But given what I do in my life today, had I been given a different opportunity, I could have become a politician, I could have become a football player, I could have become many different things. But because my life went in the miscarriage of justice, imprisonment direction, I will, and no one will ever know what I could have become. I don't.
Okay. And my second question is, do you think, or have you thought about any solutions for how the black community specifically can avoid their young men going into prison and giving you that focus from a young age so that you're living productive lives and you're able to achieve ambitions of becoming, say, a politician?
When I think about when I was a young man, there were no role models. And I know this is cliche, there were no role models, there was no mentoring, whereas today I think there are plenty of successful black men and women who could inspire other young black men and women. Equally, white young boys and girls who find themselves caught up or criminalized. So I do think that what we're doing right now, having conversations about what we can and can't do, and I do it all the time, prisoners who have ended up in prison, talking about using their skills as a criminal to transition into the life of becoming an importer or an exporter, whatever it is. It's really tough, and there are lots of organizations going out there. And I suppose my true answer, if I'm really honest, it's about integrity and credibility. I think there is a lot of work done in the community that doesn't have integrity or credibility. I think it's money motivated. And I think that a lot of money is generated to try and do that work, but it's misappropriated, it's misspent. I think a lot of it is not done in the right way. There are so many good people, good hearts, minds, wanting to help those people that you talk about. But often the resources are used in the wrong way. So for me, it's about integrity and credibility to reach those young men to really want to help them. And that's difficult because often the people that are in charge of doing that have come from those experiences and they find themselves in a position where their own lives have changed, and that changes who they are and what they really believe in, if that makes any sense.
Okay, we'll take a final question here, and then I have one online, and then we'll move on to the panel.
Hi, I wanted to ask about, you spoke about education in prison, and I noticed we have yourself, a writer, yourself, a poet on the panel as well. So yeah, if you could open up the discussion to education and the power of the spoken word or written word, that'd be appreciated.
In prison?
Specifically.
In prison, but if it goes off topic, I'm happy to listen.
You'd be surprised. I think there are limited resources. I'm working on a project, part of my charity at the moment, where we're trying to provide digital means of education. So lots of prisoners, especially as a result of COVID and the lockdowns, a lot of prisoners spend a lot of time behind their doors. If you think of a prison that houses 600 prisoners, let's say 1,000 prisoners, only 100, 200 of those prisoners in a prison setting are able to access education. That means 800 or more are not able to access education. And I think there are simple solutions, digital devices that don't have any internet, but you can put programs on there, which is one of the things that I'm trying to introduce into prisons. But I'm a big advocate of, and education can mean lots of different things in prisons, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you become a writer, correct, or you become something else. So it can mean many different upskilling individuals.
But it's integrous to anti-recidivism, right? Which is a lot of, that's integral.
Absolutely, and there's just not a lot of resources or desire to give people that opportunity, because if you do, they become a different threat. They become a different beast, a beast that can speak openly and articulate and argue what they don't want us to argue. You need to fear prisoners, right? You need to fear people that are in prison. And you won't fear somebody who's educated. You won't fear someone who can articulate their argument like we do in the real world. In prison, they need to suppress that. Why do we always champion those people who go to prison or are still in prison who are brilliant advocates? They're more scary, so they need to reduce that. And I see that all over the world. They need to suppress the ability to educate individuals because that tool is more powerful than their fist and their violence. It worked for me. I would still be in prison today had I not taken on education, had I not studied the law, had I not studied journalism when I was in prison. And my motive, let's be clear, when I was in prison, I did a correspondence journalism course, not to become a journalist, but to manipulate the media so they would write stories that I was innocent. How could I get them to write stories? I need to understand how journalism works. I need to understand how I can get a letter saying I'm innocent in the letter column of The Guardian or The Independent or The Times. So my motive was not to become a journalist, it was to manipulate the journalist, to write stories about the fact 3 black men were in prison for a crime committed by 2 white men and 1 black man. And the very first story, double-page spread in The Independent, asked the question with a picture of me and my dreadlocks, is this man white? So it worked.
And to piggyback on that, it depends on what prison you're in, right? And as a victim and intimate with victims of juvenile incarceration, which we often double forget about, right, is children, right? The resources and funding put towards you having certain materials, certain teachers, certain people who come in to advocate on your behalf and educate you are extremely limited because of the politicizing of the topic of equipping people with what he said, which would be education, a voice, advocacy of your own point. Because I'm sure you know, and I know, and Malik knows, when you locked up with certain people and they get to studying or reading or even communicating with other prisoners who have won certain pieces of their case, suddenly things get overturned. You understand what I'm saying? So it's a literal thing. But I think that if you have a lot of independent nonprofit organizations have done some good work. The one that I'm personally a part of, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is what he's speaking of. The word of what he is speaking of is anti-recidivism, keeping people out of the cycle of going into jail and coming back out because of a lack of resource, because of a cultural tendency for us to place these people in positions that don't give them any options, education being primary. So I'm really glad you asked that question. Anti-Recidivism Coalition by Scott Budnick, you can donate to them. We got Unusual Suspects, which helps with juvenile incarcerated youth, who I work with personally, who I revisited certain juvenile detention centers I may have been detained in when I was a juvenile, and go back and particularly advocate and give education to these young people. So funding is an actionable item. Finding these organizations, supporting these organizations that are always, always, always desperately seeking people like my friend here, people like him, people like Ola, to come in and market so that they can have somebody come donate so that they can help people like me. Because I'm a byproduct of those organizations. I'm a byproduct of that education. Malik?
Yeah, the work that I do now, mentoring young people, is really trying to keep them from entering that system, but it's really difficult to do that when the society is driving them towards that, because it's been designed specifically to pipeline particularly black children and poor children in that direction. So you kind of like a salmon swimming against the stream, but it's not impossible.
Correct.
But I think the work that I do now is primarily around the structural changes and the institutional changes at a policy level. Because if you can change the policy and the rationale that you were talking about the mindset that people have about punishment, that these people automatically deserve punishment. Joint enterprise is one of the classic examples. One person commits a crime, 5 people who are associated with that person all go to prison, and they all get the same sentence. You know, is a way of optimizing, if you like, the ability to be able to get as many black people and poor people off the streets and into that system as possible. So unless you do things at the core policy level, at the legislative level, to change not only that mindset, but also the legal capacity for people of that mindset to do those things, as much as we do the advocacy work on the streets and as much as we try and help people within the institutions, we won't be able to stop them being pipelined in. That is something that has to happen, you know, at a congressional level, at a parliamentary level, at a statutory level, at a policy level, and that's why I think we have to work, you know, across all of those spheres simultaneously in order to be able to get a more holistic approach to prison reform, and also, you know, in terms of the care system, where you know, childhood incarceration as well. That's my thoughts on it.
Hope we answered your question.
Thank you so much for that. Raphael, do you have any final comments?
No, I don't. I appreciate you listening and engaging. You know, what I will say is there's no one answer to any of these problems that we're talking about. We are coming at it from our experiences, and we approach it differently. We're dealing with it in different countries. What I will say, and I said it in the talk, is that the privileged position that I have to go to prisons around the world to make a TV documentary for Netflix. I like to think it's done with credibility. I like to think it's done with integrity. It's not made up. I engage with individuals. I get safe passage in some of the most dangerous places because I build trust with the individuals. And I talk about the systemic changes that are needed, the reintegration, the rehabilitation. But the one thing that I always take away from my visits to all of these prisons, whether it is in Papua New Guinea, whether it is in countries where I don't speak the language, there is one thing that I take away, and I would urge everybody to take away from this conversation and conversations they have, is listening. A lot of these prisoners that I sit down and speak to have never told their story to anybody before. Nobody's ever asked them the question about who they really are, why they did what they did. And that's not me delving into somebody who's committed a double murder or is a serial rapist, etc. Nobody has ever asked. They've been caught, tried, convicted, but nobody has ever asked them why. And why is that important? It's because we can learn from what they're sharing. We can understand what drives the behavior of certain individuals in certain countries, certain cultures. So for me, my final word is listening, hearing other people's experience does give people hope.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Can we get a final round of applause for Raphael? And a welcome for Chelsea Jackson, who will be moderating our next panel.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Jackson. I'm so excited. Thank you so much, Raphael, Malcolm, Adam, for being here today. And I want to actually start with the last point that we left off with, Raphael, because I think there was something really powerful in what you said, which is no one asks the why. How did this happen? How did we get here? And I'm reminded of a quote by Angela Y. Davis, where she talks about the prison as a place where we disappear all the questions we would have to ask to understand how the social problems came to be that created this incidence of violence in the first place. Right. And so when we send someone to prison, we no longer have to ask and answer all of the questions that are needed to really see how did we get here. So this brings me to this first initial question about social problems. And from your vantage point, thinking about social problems and how they end up in the prison, when you look at everything that's wrong with the world, if you will, from poverty to lack of education to lack of access to racism or white supremacy, how do we see those social problems showing up in prisons, in the criminal justice system, and in the lives of the people who are impacted? Maybe I'll start with Malcolm, and then we'll come across.
Of course you start with me. Thanks, Chelsea. First, let me start by saying there was a tad bit of imposter syndrome coming here, right? First of all, I'm American, and we know that we're a joke. I'm kidding. And also, there are far better people to speak on these issues, like Chelsea, like Angela Davis, who I've had the benefit of interviewing at UCLA, like, there's so many, Cornel West. These people are alive. Michelle Alexander, who wrote The Jim Crow, New Jim Crow. There's so many qualified people, and I went, how do we wrestle with these social topics? And I'm sure, Raphael, you understand this, and I'm sure you've experienced this with these massive topics that systems far beyond us, institutions with far more money, far more resources, far brighter minds have failed to address. And I go, what is the perspective that is unique that I could bring to this panel? And why do I care about bringing any kind of credibility to Cambridge anyway? And I have answers to those questions. One is, Ola asked me, that means a woman of color asked me. So I'm immediately validated. Number two, academia and on the ground, victims of a culture of oppression, victims of the culture of subjugation, victims of a culture of racism, and we don't often hear from the prisoners, like you said, from the inmates, from the street, from the trenches, and I am a proud trench baby. I'm a proud survivor of those things. So my contribution to this distinguished institution is, and to the people out there, is that I was there. Raphael was there, Malik was there, we was there. And we have the benefit of language. We have the blessing of mother. I had a mother that cared. I'm sorry, Malik, I did. And it was so sad to hear what happened to you. Because I realized without my mama, without your sister, I wouldn't have the vehicle of language. I wouldn't have the vehicle to express to these institutions, to speak their language, so to say, to speak to the people, to go, hey, look, I'm a human. I didn't just go out and hurt nobody. I didn't choose to go hurt nobody. I was left with virtually no choice in the first place. So my contribution to those very large questions we will continue to wrestle with on this panel, and specifically that one is, it starts with humanity. It starts with understanding, it starts with listening, and then we can get into actionable items on how we can get to fix these things. But because you can't prescribe a solution where you have no understanding of the diagnosis of the illness in the first place. And we are proud survivors, cancer survivors on this stage, these three and I, right? Cancer survivors. We are the survivors of the cancer of cultural indemnity and inequity. And I'm proud to be here to say, hopefully I can help give y'all a little bit more of that missing gap between academia and on the ground. So it starts with humanity for me, and it starts with the children for me. That's my particular activism. You?
I really appreciate that, Malcolm, especially the point that you made about being a living witness, having lived in the intersections of so many of these things, having come from communities that are the most marginalized, that are the least resourced, that are the most plagued with all of the social problems we just listed. And as you said, to come now and to bear witness to the perspective of those communities, but also to bring the humanity. And this is what I really appreciated about when you said, what do I have to offer? For me as a criminologist, and I'm currently writing a chapter actually with someone named Ben about the particular fact that we so rarely hear the voices of people who've been incarcerated.
I don't think anyone's asked me why. Rafi,
Right?
I kind of feel bad. Thanks, man.
But it's like that requires a humanizing of the person. And at the beginning, Raphael, you mentioned all of the terms and categories that we use to label people, from prisoner, convict, felon, and as an abolitionist, we use people first language. We say people who are incarcerated. When you look back over your work of all the prisons that you visited in different countries, have you seen distance from the use of like prisoner, convict? Have you seen in environments or prisons where people's humanity was respected? And what did that look like in those places where people were more humanized?
I'm going to give you a couple of examples because even I was surprised to see it for myself in these particular countries and cultures. But before I say that, I want to pick up on the point that humanity is key, but ignorance for me is also so prevalent. And when I talk about ignorance, I mean the young men who get criminalized, the people that end up in prison, the people that we are talking about all the time are ignorant of their own existence because nobody shares with them the possibilities that exist or the opportunities and pathways that they can take. And that really does come back to that lack of education, and it's about sharing those opportunities and that somebody can be more than what they are being prescribed as by a state or by the police or by the color of their skin or their gender, etc. I think there is a real big ignorance there. The two experiences that I'll talk about, one was in the Philippines where they didn't call prisoners prisoners. They didn't call people in prison, serving prison sentences, convicts. They wore T-shirts. Every prisoner wears a T-shirt, a yellow T-shirt, and on the T-shirt it says person who's lost their liberty. That's how they describe them. So they're no longer being described, and this is in the Philippines, and their resources are minimal. It's so overcrowded. I spent 7 days spooning on the floor with other prisoners because they don't have any beds, they don't have any mattresses. The prison is so overcrowded. They could fill this hall with prisoners and still there would be a shift of prisoners. You've got to watch the Philippine episode in Manila. They have a shift of prisoners who wait for a space to then sleep. Correct. So you have a percentage of the prisoners who can't sleep until some have had their shift to sleep and they get up and they spoon, and there's cockroaches and there's all kind of insects that kind of nibble you through the night. But they still have that sense of humanity where they call them people who have lost their liberty. They don't call them prisoners. They don't treat them in that way. And the other place was Cyprus, in the prison in Cyprus. And this was driven by a formidable director called Anna. She was having to grapple with the influx of asylum seekers and people who were leaving war-torn countries or countries where they had to flee. And so Cyprus was dealing with a lot of prisoners who were coming from West, North Africa and various other places who had been criminalized because they were fleeing, and because they didn't have proper passports, they were automatically sent to prison for 12 months. her behavior, her act of humanity surprised me like I've not been surprised anywhere. She provided them with clothes, she provided them with food and water, not by asking for new resources, she reallocated the resources. So instead of buying new tables and chairs for the prison staff, she bought trainers, shorts, t-shirts for these prisoners. Now what was really phenomenal, and I thought it was a bit of get up at the beginning, when Anna leaves her office and walks into the socialization space out in the exercise yard, all of these prisoners start singing and dancing, Anna, Anna, because they respect her, she respects them, she doesn't believe they deserve to be in prison because they are fleeing war-torn countries. And so she created a humane environment where they're not seen, and she doesn't see. And I tested her on this by sort of saying prisoners, and she refused to use the term prisoner. She calls them people who are desperate, or she calls them by their name. They are individuals. So there are two examples there where, and I've seen this in a couple of other places, like Norway, where they shake the hands of prisoners, you know, rehumanizing those individuals. So it's these little acts that make a huge difference in these institutions that you do not find in the States, you do not find in the United Kingdom, because there is this mentality of us and them, which is understandable because of the way prisons were created and the industrial stuff in America. So those are examples for me where humanity has overcome the oppressor or the authorities.
I really appreciate that, Raphael, and it gives us a seamless transition into a bit of historical analysis and overview that I love to get from Adam. Because of what you mentioned, Raphael, and the countries that you mentioned Norway, and so anyone who's familiar with criminology or who's looked into abolition will have heard a lot about the Swedish prison systems. But I really appreciate that you acknowledge that it depends on your citizenship, what your experience of those prisons are. But the other piece about the community in the prison in the Philippines, right? And so when we look at the racial and economic histories of countries like the US and the UK, or even Australia and New Zealand, where we see First Islander and First Nations people being overwhelmingly incarcerated. Adam, it would be great if you could just give us a little bit of understanding of what is the history of imperialism and, you know, capital and labor? Like, what are these broader histories have to do with why things are so different in the UK and in its Commonwealth or in its former colonies?
That's a very big question. I'll try
not to take up.
I'll try and not take up too much time. So, I guess if we're thinking about Britain for now, I think it's useful to consider the fact that the British state, first and foremost, of course, isn't a nation state. Right? Britain is an imperial state. It was founded in 1707, not as a nation, but as an empire. Right? It already had colonies. It was already slowly becoming the largest slave trading nation in human history. Right? We have to think about it in this context. And if it emerges as not a nation state, but as an imperial state, then we have to understand racial governance to be fundamental to British governance, right? Racism was the way in which Britain and other European nations not simply justified, but rationalized transatlantic slavery, the colonization of the Americas and Australasia, right? The stripping of the freedoms and sovereignty of peoples across Africa and parts of Asia. And enslaving a lot of people, exterminating a huge number of people, and stripping the rights and freedoms from a significant number of people requires a lot of policing. You'd be surprised to hear, because they don't take it sitting down. And so for most of Britain's history, Westminster, where all of that legislative debate takes place, has been about not simply governing the British mainland, but governing its vast empire. And so creating a policing system, creating a prison system which can effectively control an empire necessitates a series of racialized ideas about who is violent and who is a threat, who is a criminal and who is not. And so when we think about that imperial context, what we see is that for most of Britain's history, that is where prison making, criminalization, and policing has taken place. So the first British policing depends where you start the story, but the first real British policing doesn't take place here on the British mainland. The first uniformed routine patrols to enforce the law takes place in the British colony of St. Lucia. It's interesting because my family's from St. Lucia, so it was already personal, but now it's already personal. And this arises because of a series of slave rebellions that take place after the Haitian Revolution in 1804. And Britain takes St. Lucia off of the French, alongside a couple of other islands, and they say, okay, these slaves are going to keep rebelling all the time, right? So we need to have something more routine. We can't just have a yeomanry and a militia who come and, repress a rebellion whenever it rises up. We need regular patrols watching these slaves, right? And that is what they institute. And it's from there, all of the lessons that are learned and all the kind of infrastructure, the governance infrastructure that's developed on these Caribbean islands is then sent to Britain. And Britain starts to institute it in a more routine way on the British mainland and begin to spread it across other parts of its empire as well. So if we understand policing in that kind of way, and of course this being a kind of conduit to the establishment of the prison system, then we have to, I think that can help us to understand why racism is just as endemic to the British police and prison system as it is in the United States.
Thank you so much, Adam. And yeah, absolutely. Round of applause. Thank you so much.
Chelsea, before you go, can I add to that? The Treatise of Policing of a Metropolitan, right? Patrick Calhoun, correct? He, if I'm not mistaken, just to bring it back to the U.S., because we like to monopolize everything. I believe he had slaves in America. He came from a family of slave owners and people who had a lot of practice in how to properly regulate property and ownership, which I believe is how we get policing, right? It is meant to protect and serve the bourgeoisie, not those who are poor, whether you're Irish, Scottish, Black, whatever it may be, of Latin descent, Arabian, Muslim, whatever. It is not meant to protect and serve us. It is meant to protect and serve those who own property, albeit we were property, right? So a lot of those modern day revolutionary, let's say the iPhone, slavery was the UK, right? Y'all was Apple. A lot of that mandate was, if I'm not mistaken, helped by the US's, go ahead and do it for me. I'm trying to give it to you so you can do it. But I would like you to show how we had a large part in influencing that culture and that mandate.
Yeah, I really appreciate this alley-oop, as I'll call it.
You saw how I was going to do it.
Because I was actually going to say that similarly as an American, when I moved here to the UK 5 years ago, the most mind-blowing experience was having British people tell me that white supremacy was an American invention. Mm-hmm. And being...
Export.
Yes. And I'm like, where did America come from?
Yeah.
How did it come to be? How was it stolen from the native peoples of Turtle Island? Like, how did that whole thing happen? You weren't involved, I guess. But the reason that I really appreciate you bringing up the first British policing being in St. Lucia, right, is that our understanding of who is policed and who is protected by the police.
Correct.
And this brings in the point that you mentioned, Malcolm, in terms of who is a person, right? And so we can look back through British history and see that personhood is defined by who you own, how much property, what's your relationship to the king, what's your relationship to the state.
Which is exactly what I wanted to get into with y'all, policing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this kind of brings me back to something that I would love to kind of get everyone's perspectives on here, which is when we think about the police, I'm particularly thinking of this because of Raphael's point about acknowledging the victims of crime and people who experience harm. How do we square the circle that most of the people we refer to as criminals have also been victims of crime? How do we square the circle that, and I wanted to get the most accurate results, 25% in the UK of people who are in prison have left care, like Malik did. So you were in control of the state up until you were 18 years old, and then 25% of the people sitting in prisons right now were in the care of the state until they were 18. So whose responsibility is that? Is it the state's?
Sound like a shit parent.
I want to pause here and get a perspective from Malik, if that's all right.
So I just wanted to say I did some work with a policy institute in Bristol called the Brigstow Institute. When I published my book, I wanted them to get policymakers for child social care in the room so that I could use my story as a case study on how not to treat children in care. And they brought in the policymakers, and two of them, one of them's Dr. Debbie Watson, and she and one of her colleagues had done a survey of women in prisons across the UK. Their survey was really just trying to understand the nature and the profile of female prisoners who were incarcerated in the UK. And in the context of their kind of ethnographic study in prisons of those women, they found out, and this was just incidental, it wasn't one of the target questions, but it was just something that came out in those interviews, because in many cases it was the first time anyone had ever asked them about themselves or why they were there. Over 60% disclosed of the female population of prisons in the UK disclosed that not only were they in the care system, but they were sexually abused whilst they were in the care system. And as a consequence of the trauma they suffered, they then came out, acted out and behaved in the way that they behaved, which then put them into the prison system. So you're talking about people who've been brought into the care system because of familial breakdown or things to do with, you know, circumstances beyond their own control. They're abused within the system, by the system. They then constitute 60% of the female prison population. You are effectively creating the people that you are afraid of.
Yeah, correct. That's the pathology of it, for sure.
Thank you so much. And what I want to toss to the panel here is this thought about how do we humanize people when we've really taken the most vulnerable people in our society, the most marginalized, the people with the least amount of access, the least amount of resources, and we've criminalized them. And we've taken the behaviors that they do, and we arrest them. And the reason I say this is drug use is not concentrated in any class. If we went into the city of London and saw the amount of coke that's going around. So drug use is not concentrated in lower income communities, but the people who go to prison for drugs are coming from those communities. So my question is, when we have these people who are being labeled criminals, are being labeled violent, and have been violent towards others, but they've also experienced violence. How do we start to square the circle? How do we use terms like victim and criminal when we're talking about human beings? I'm curious about each of your perspectives on that.
Well, you wanna...
I might say something very quick about these categories, if that's right. I know it was kind of touched on already. This is something I always say to my students, so apologies if you've heard me say it before, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. If you are suspected of carrying a gun in Tottenham, right, you'll probably get arrested by the police. If you're Mark Duggan, they'll shoot you dead, right? But if you sell F-16s to Saudi Arabia or cluster bombs to Israel, you'll probably get arrested, right? So there's something here that tells us, oh, maybe these laws about the dissemination of weapons has less to do with morality or justice or safety, and have something far more closely connected to class and, by extension, race, right? If you are suspected of smoking a spliff on Brixton High Street, you expect to be stopped by police, right? But if you sell highly addictive forms of antidepressants through the pharmaceutical industry, if you sell tobacco, if you sell alcohol, you are a pillar of British industry.
You are a master of industry, yes you are.
Not only are you not criminalised, crucially, this is crucial, not only are you not criminalised, you are protected by the criminal justice system, right? Right, the polar opposites, right? There are still parents who are serving time in prison for handling goods appropriated during the riots of 2011, following the police murder of Mark Duggan, right? They're still in jail today, right? But if you invade Iraq and, kill 500,000 people and cancel every oil contract and replace those oil contracts with your oil companies and extracts those resources to enormous profits, who are you, right? You're Tony Blair and you're now Middle East peace envoy,
correct.
right?
Correct.
So there is something fundamental about, violence and drug dissemination and theft, which has nothing to do whatsoever with
With
morality,
justice, yeah.
crime, and justice.
So to speak on that, I think that the ruling class or the institutions at large have performed this brilliant piece of marketing, right? Like they're the most effective marketers. Only Kris Jenner could probably compete, where they have now placed a monopoly on morality. They have placed a monopoly on justice and what that means and what it looks like. And we as the common folk have done a terrible job with combating that marketing. That's why we are all here today. This is just talk. This is just Symposium, which I believe is a byproduct of Plato, if anybody's read that book. This is just us in a vacuum. But it is important because we reemphasize that, hey, there's somebody out there with a heart, with humanity. There's advocates out here. But the purpose for this is for you guys to be armed with as much information as possible, with as much ideas on what resources are as possible, so that you can go and achieve advocacy and being an acolyte out in the real world. Because I'm not here to just talk to people. I'm here to learn, A, and B, be re-enthused when I go fight that good war outside. And for me, understanding the pathology even of policing itself, police weren't started by rich people getting in, picking up guns and like policing the poor. That's not what happened. They don't get their hands dirty. What they did was they paid our fellow man, right? The yeomanship that you spoke of, the local militia that we spoke of, the rich people who had acquired resources and concerted resources and concentrated resources, please correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, they paid people to police their own people. Before it was volunteership and niggas just got drunk and played cards, right? And it really sucked at their jobs, right? Which is why we get the treatise on modern metropolitan policing, and then we get the Bobbies, which is from Bobby being a bitch. And I like to call people out directly. I'm gonna cuss. Because I think that there are certain people who are purveyors of some of this insidious nature who just go by history and we don't know their names. We know Michael Jordan, but we don't know Bobby. We don't know Patrick Calhoun. We don't know these people. So they mark ass niggas and we gotta call them out. Because they have done a good job of villainizing myself, Raphael, and Malik. Malik and Obama's name immediately trigger the public, right? They've done a great job of marketing that certain tonations, certain formations of speech and language immediately cause you, even me, when I step in the city, when I step with my brothers, it's immediately, am I here to meet harm? Am I going to be harmed? When you step in those prisons, the first thing you think about is your safety, as if these aren't your brother, your sister, your mother, your cousin, your homie. Like, I went to school with these people. And the police as well are unionized local people. None of them rich except for the commissioners. None of them rich except for the politicians that cut their checks. None of them are rich. They have good pensions, most of them, because they fought that union fight, which is a byproduct of what? The proletariat. And as a, right, let's talk about it. So as a proud product of the proletariat sitting here with you today, I hate to say it, but you have to realize that they are brainwashed as well. The police themselves, the COs themselves, that's the correctional officers in the facilities themselves. I don't know what they call them in other countries. But the sheriffs themselves, which, by the way, to be a sheriff in America, you have to do time where? Go ahead, Rafi. I know you know this.
I have no idea.
You know this. To be a CO or a correctional officer, first, before you go on the street and be a sheriff and police. Military. All right. Yeah. So you're militarizing the mindset. You're brainwashing the people who are supposed to be regulating already. Before you even get there, their first few years are spent in prison with inmates, the hardest criminals, or whatever that means, right? And then they come out to the street and police my brothers, my family, my homies, me, personally. That's why when the sheriffs come around, we like, oh, shit, bro, they gonna be extra hard. And I'm telling you that when you get that mentality, you like, well, shoot, I'm not gonna be a victim. I got to be able to go to war and step with them, right? So you make yourself into this person, you build yourself into this armor so that you can simply survive. But then you are gaslit. The best gaslight that's ever happened is by the institutions themselves that perpetuate this, because they make you feel like you being punished for simply mimicking the behavior that they've taught you, right? Like, that's the biggest gaslight that's ever happened in my life, is being told that somehow me being a part of a gang or tribalism where we wear colors and we call it flagging and we do this and we protect our block or our specific territory, as if I didn't learn that from colonialism in the 15th century. As if somehow they don't got flags, as if somehow they don't have colors, as if somehow they ain't murdered thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, but because I'm protecting my brother who I grew up with and we grew up across the block and his mama hungry or his homeboy got shot or his brother got killed and we out here protecting ourselves and armed, which some constitutions protect, right? But because it hasn't been done through the legal systems where they can profit or where they can police or where they can regulate or where they can confine or where they can tax, we are criminalized. I simply say that the pathology goes deeper than just me as the person who's been convicted of a crime. And by the way, I've only been convicted once in my life. I've been locked up 7 times. And I've done more time than most people who've been convicted of the damn crime. So when I'm in these situations and I look at my CO and I look at my sheriffs, right? And I look at the people who are involved in this, all of us have been infected by this marketing. All of us have been infected by this idea of what is wrong, what is right, what is just, what is moral, right? But the idea of policing, the idea of incarceration, imprisonment, shout out to Michelle Alexander, has all come from the crown. Because the first police were people who were doing the will of the crown, of protecting the assets and property of the crown, including you and I. Because we were also, white or black, poor or not poor, you were essentially the property of the crown. And then that evolved into what we know it is today, where people get paid a job to police their fellow man. And I think that that's important to understand before we even start talking about, well, how do we start humanizing people? We're all human. And I'm gonna tell you right now, the worst part is if you gave my homeboy who was my cellie or your co-defendant or whoever, if they didn't have ethics in the first place, you give them money, they're gonna act the same fucking way. So it has to start with understanding ethical morality is not something of the bourgeoisie. It is moving out of the way when you're in traffic. It's extending that hand that Gil Scott-Heron did for you, what that white man did for you, what John Singleton did for me, what a white man named Gary Martin, who passed away at Sony Pictures, who's a part of another institution of a type, who said, I'm gonna give you an opportunity to create and tell your story so that we can create empathy with these machines of media, right? Which is why you are so important, and which is why you are so important. That's my answer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can I just very briefly say, when we talk about crime or criminal and victim, when I reflect on the times that I was held in the segregation isolation block, all on my own, stripped naked and beaten as I described earlier, I was both deemed a criminal and a victim at the very same time. As a victim of the system, having been brutalized by it, and obviously criminalized by the full Fifth Estate, the journalist who called me a monster and called for hanging. And so a lot of the solutions that I try to provide today, for example, on my podcast, I speak to numerous types of criminals. One of the biggest drug traffickers we worked with, the UK's biggest drug trafficker, a guy called Curtis Warren, who you may be familiar with, his sidekick.
I was actually incarcerated with Curtis in 1975 when I was 9 years old and he was 13 years old.
Right.
He went on to become the biggest drug kingpin in this country.
And this is,
one of the biggest in the
and this is the interesting thing, because
he was a child. He was incarcerated as a child.
But
he was a victim.
For me, Malik, now this is what's important, and this is where I look for the solution. That is the image, the biggest drug trafficker, kingpin in the UK. You know, the Pablo Escobar, if you like, of the UK, Curtis Warren. And I recently, and I do this with most of my guests, who generally have a criminal backstory. Before we go into the details of the crimes that they've committed, I like to relay to them the image that has been portrayed of them. So you've been described as the biggest kingpin, you've been described as a gangster, you've been described as X, Y, Z. Here is your opportunity to tell us who you really are. Yeah. And what you find is that most of what they've been described as is not true. It's not true. Yes, they've been involved in criminality, but the image that has been portrayed of this individual is not true. And it's exactly what I do when I do my Netflix show and I meet these individuals. I give them that voice to say who they are, as opposed to what the state, the media have described them as. And you inevitably discover that they are not the person that they've been portrayed. I was not the monster, the murderer, and the robber that I was described as by the media, that everybody wanted to believe, and that the state built into the narrative that led to my conviction. I didn't stand a chance in hell, even though the victims had described the perpetrators as 2 white and 1 black. In that courtroom, the image that had been portrayed of me as a leader of a gang who terrorized the stockbroker, that's what led to my conviction, not the facts, not the truth, not justice. And so for me, the important thing about crime, or criminals and victims, is that they are one of the same, but we often don't listen to what they have to say about who they truly are. And everybody in this room knows they are not quite what they're made out to be. And that, for me, is where you find a solution to challenge some of the typical portrayal of crime and victims. And you get exactly the same from the victims. And I'll say this finally, the one thing that's blown me away about the work that I've been doing on Netflix is the global audience's reaction to the people that are in the show, the people that I spend time with, who they have an affinity, an empathy, a sympathy for. They want to send money, they want to help. And it even surprises me sometimes when this double murderer who has committed an horrendous crime has garnered the sympathy just by sharing their story. I'm not, as I've said before, trying to advocate that the crimes that they committed are justified in any way or condone it in any way. But the portrayal of those individuals, once they portray who they really are, garners a sympathy that can change the narrative, which is what I'm about.
Thank you so much for that point, Raphael, about the narrative, but also for highlighting some of the language that was used when you were wrongfully convicted, and even bringing us back, Malcolm, to your point about the idea of being in a gang and how that language automatically brings up racist stereotypes. And so when you hear a gang member, what image comes to your mind? What skin tone are you thinking of? What gender are you thinking of, right? What class background are you thinking of? How is that person dressed? How does that person talk, right? And even similarly, when you said you were portrayed as the leader of a gang who terrorized. That's a word we've been hearing a lot in the media lately, terrorist. Again, ask yourself that same question. What skin tone comes to mind when I hear that? What gender? What does that person look like? Where are they from in the world? And why is it that these violent terms are so closely connected with racist and xenophobic, Islamophobic stereotypes? And we really have to ask ourselves, and this kind of brings me back to the point that you were making earlier, Malcolm, about the parallels. So I ask you, if you were to take someone from one place against their will to another place, we would call that kidnapping, unless you're a police officer. Then it's holding someone for questioning.
Or the East India Trading Company.
We would say that putting a part of your body into someone else's body without their consent is assault, unless you're an intake officer in one of Her Majesty's prisons. And then it's just a part of the process of you being, right? And so when we think about how deeply connected race and politics and power dynamics and financial background, class background are intertwined with the idea of who's a criminal and who's not, who's been convicted, who isn't, who's dangerous and who is not. It really requires us to go back to the drawing board. And so I actually want to go all the way back to one of your first comments about thinking about abolition as doing something different. So for me, as an abolition, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a kind of we flip a switch and we close all the prisons and get rid of all the police, and then we live in a magical, wonderful land where there are rainbows everywhere and violence never happens. That's not realistic, right? But for me, abolition is the process of creating a world that doesn't rely on, as Angela Davis calls them, places where we sequester people away from their communities, right? And away from the people who love them. I want to live in a world that doesn't respond to violence and social problems by locking people in a cage. And so I'm curious of the three of you. I'm not asking you for a one-size-fits-all. I'm not asking you for a silver bullet. I'm asking you to add to the list of institutions or programs or resources that Black communities, but all communities need to get to that world where we don't respond to social problems by locking each other in cages. What are, as W.E.B. Du Bois called them, the democratic institutions that we need to replace the controlling fascist institution that is the criminal justice system?
I think that's unfair. I think that's so wildly unfair.
We have some on the table already. Raphael's given us mentorship, education.
Yeah.
So just add to that list.
Like I said, Olayemi Olarin is a practicing lawyer in Brooklyn. So she's on the ground, and she's a abolitionist as well. And we get into many an argument about this. So I actually I don't want to, what I would counter is that I'd say that there's far more qualified people to handle that specific list. But if I had to contribute, what we are currently doing is definitely a needed thing. What you guys are currently doing is definitely needed, because engaging with policy is important. I think that, all of the miniature revolutionaries in the room, we face a problem because a lot of these programs that we are talking about require finance. And financing. So, exactly. So Olayemi and I get into this about as well, because she's also, I'm going to put her business out there. I hope she's watching. She's a green card citizen. She's Bahamian, and she's came over to the States, got a great degree at great institutions, and she's a public figure and public intellectual, and she's an abolitionist as well. And she often gets in fights with people on the opposite side of online. And I always end up telling her, it's funny because even she can't make money as a citizen. She's not a citizen, so she can't necessarily go into private practice until she gets her citizenship, which is funny because I'm going, love, we need you on the front lines, and if you can't afford to pay your rent, then what are we talking about, right? I mean, that's often how they get us, right? Our leaders, they appropriate us. They put Raphael in Vivienne Westwood. They put us in Dior, and they fund our lives, and they attack our children's well-beings and our financial well-being. So I think finance and being economically viable, you have to be able to fund the revolution that's going to be televised. So that means people like you going to meet with, being consult to these institutions, providing media that makes profit for the institution that is Netflix, and also instituting certain requirements that they continue to feed the communities that they're distressing. I think that that's important. Money. People need money. Good people need to make some money. And I hate the idea that that's a reality, but y'all got to stop playing poor. There's no romanticism to being in poverty. That we like to pretend like impoverished people are perfect. We like to pretend like the rich are evil. And we benefited from the benefactors of people who are in a higher position. You have to be that person in a higher position. You have the opportunity, you have the resources, you have this institution. You know what? Use their credibility. Use it against them. You know what I mean? Don't purport their ideals when you come in here. Don't get converted. Keep your proletariat spirit. But take that out and go make some money and help a kid, help a child, help a woman, help somebody. And come together, build these programs, these foundations. So I'm going to keep saying Anti-Recidivism Coalition, started by Scott Budnick. And I'm going to say the Unusual Suspects from my side of the pond. And hopefully I will continue to have my own philanthropic endeavors because those are important. Mentorship, advocacy, money for those programs. Storytelling helps, so fund the good shit.
Yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm. And I really, really appreciate you saying money in so many ways, because I think the investment, but also the economic self-determination, the ownership, the ability to make decisions, the ability to be employers, right? To own our businesses, to dictate our communities. And as Marcus Garvey would say, those are fundamental tenets to the elimination of racial injustice in the world. Raphael?
I echo that by using two terms, and one would be social mobility, which is exactly what we're talking about. But more importantly, I think there is an element of exposure that is needed to elevate people from their position. And I'll give you an example. I recently gave a talk to one of the UK's big private legal firms called Shoesmith. They have offices all over the country, and they work in real estate. They work for very, very wealthy individuals, their portfolios. And I gave a talk, and the room was predominantly, what you would expect, and there was a few odd faces. That fitted in but didn't fit in, if you know what I mean. And I was doing this thing with the CEO, and I asked a very simple question. And the idea that we were talking about was social mobility. How do they get people from marginalized, deprived communities or, low education, into an environment like this? They didn't really mean it, but they were having the conversation. And I said to them, here's the solution. Next week, I'm going to go to a friend of mine who runs a project in Brixton where they mentor a group of young boys who have recently been released from prison, and I'm going to bring those boys into your offices. I want to expose them to the world that they've never been exposed, to inspire them to think that, well, why can't I put on a clean shirt and sit in this room and become what you are? Why? So it's about exposure, and that's exactly what I did. They didn't like it, but they were in a room where they couldn't refuse it. So that week I got a group of kids who were like, I don't want to go do that, that's not my world. Well, music might be your world, but it doesn't have to be the only world. Sport, again, doesn't have to be the only world. Don't be cocooned into a space that people... And I took these group of boys, 2 of them, since then, have applied for a internship at these offices. Whether they get it or not is a big question. So for me, it's about social mobility, and that does require finances, but exposure can be just as powerful. We know. When I was a kid growing up in South East London, I grew up in South East London, I didn't even know places like Manchester, and this is the truth. This is how ignorant I was, which is why I say ignorance is an important thing to overcome. I didn't know places like Liverpool, Manchester existed. I really wasn't exposed until I was in prison and I heard these Liverpudlian accents, these Scouser accents. Honestly, that's how naive my world was in South East London. And I know there are hundreds of thousands of kids who are cocooned in that world as well, where they are not exposed to animals on farms. And we know people use that all the time. Let's take them to a farm and expose. But exposure for me is key. And the proof is in the pudding. When I took those kids into this shoesmith's offices, they were ducks out of water. They looked really odd in there. But that's because their appearance didn't fit in. Doesn't mean that their mind can't fit in. Their ability, their skills. And these are smart kids. These are kids that have survived traumas that I couldn't even share with you because they're so sad. But there was a moment of inspiration, at least for 2 of those kids. The others probably thought that they would never fit in, but there were 2 kids in particular who thought, I'm going to go for this, and they'd never been exposed. So for me, social mobility comes from the corporates, the institutions that we're talking about that try and put the blockers on, opening their doors. And it takes people like us to push those doors, or at least put our foot in to stop them closing, because they all say they want to do the right thing with their corporate responsibility, da-di-da-di-da, but you've got to be brave enough to stand and put them to the test. And when I did that in that moderation, would you have a group of kids coming in? Oh, yes, we would. The next week, I said, well, I'm going to bring kids in here next week. So it was really awkward for that CEO to say, on second thoughts, and he did try that. He did try after to sort of say, well, we don't have the time, we don't have this. But those odd faces that were working in that, I worked with them to get those kids in there. And they were excited, like going to Alton Towers or going on a roller coaster or something, just to be in a legal office. But the offices were swish. They were an environment that these kids had never been exposed to before, So it inspired them. Social mobility and exposure to those opportunities, just to let them know they can be more than what others want them to become.
And those relationships are a resource within themselves. So let me revise my last comment. Not just monetary, but any resource that can, of course, help is necessary, because now they have that resource. All of us were benefited from that resource of a relationship in a space that we naturally aren't from. Thank you, Adam.
I might add something, but maybe from a slightly different kind of perspective. Of course, social mobility is important. It's something that my parents' generation and myself benefited from a great deal. But I think it's also really incumbent on us to think more collectively than social mobility. Social mobility can be quite atomized and be quite individualistic and rely upon certain individuals, right? And I can maybe illustrate this with an anecdote. I did my PhD at a university equally as alienating as this one, but on the other side of London. And there was, 1 or 2, other out-of-place faces, right? And of course, what happens when you're at somewhere like an institution like that? You're consistently, confused for domestic worker, a security guard, somebody who's just lost, right?
Service.
And you'd go and have a drink, have dinner with the other black students, and you'd be talking about the day you've had where you've been, these things have happened, right? And I remember one of the students saying to me, I think it was a South African student as well, actually. South African students were, they were about that life. And they said to me, look, Adam, some of the black students here, they keep saying, why do I keep getting confused as a cleaner? Why do I keep getting confused as a cleaner? And some of the other black students here asked the question, why are all the cleaners black?
All right, all right.
And that's a very different kind of question, right? That asks us a more kind of structural, collective question, right? And what does that tell us about class and race within our society? And instead of actually thinking to ourselves, right, we need to get more like black professors out here, which of course we do, right? That's not going to structurally change our system as much as being like, all right, so are the cleaners here unionized? Do they get holiday pay? Do they get sick pay? Do they get, do they have pension contributions? Do they have secure immigration status? Like, how can we think about actually the economic circumstances that most black people live in, which are working class conditions, and collectively improve those, right? Yeah. That requires renters' unions to improve people's living housing conditions. That requires trade unions to improve people's working conditions. And I think thinking about that kind of collective uplift is equally, maybe even, actually I would argue, more important than thinking about these kinds of individual social mobility, which of course are very important as well. As I would be a hypocrite to say that it isn't, because otherwise I wouldn't be sitting there right now, because otherwise, yeah.
Because you won. So you won at life is what happened. I'm just kidding.
Is what it is.
No, I really appreciate this, particularly your point about the collective approach, and it's about balancing these two things, right? If the amount of money that you had eliminated white supremacy, Oprah wouldn't have gone into, a store and tried to purchase a Birkin and have it snatched out of her hand and be told she couldn't afford the bag. So we can't only have money and social mobility, right, and access, because then we haven't addressed the structural issues that are in place. So it's a combination between having those mentors and those leaders who extend their privilege and their access to create pathways. It's about investing in the leaders and in the community organizations that are really on the ground and are really fighting to solve the social problems that are affecting all of us. It's about passing the microphone to leaders who are coming out of prison, who aren't the perfect victims, who don't have college degrees, and allowing them and providing that space for them to lead and create solutions in their own communities. It's about challenging stereotypes. It's about calling the Sun and the Daily Mail and challenging their, description of an incarcerated person or someone charged with a crime. It's about these collective efforts of looking beyond ourselves in our own performance, in our own homes, in our own families, to look out across our community and really try and transform things. And I think what the three of you have offered has given me so much enthusiasm. And I think I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in space with all of you, to have learned from all of you, and to get to this point in the conversation where I feel there's a clear path forward. Like, we can all see from wherever you're sitting in the room, things that you can think about, things that you can lean into more, things that you can do differently. And that's where I like to leave a panel, because there's no point if we all just talk and then go home and nothing about us changes or transforms. So I thank you all so much. I'd love to jump to questions.
Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So yeah, we're just gonna open it up to the audience. Yeah, okay, so how about we start all the way back there? Yeah.
So there's probably two parts to this question, and it may differ from UK to the States. In your experience, and it has changed probably over the past 40 years, how has the media changed the narrative of a person with regards to, we have the press, the tabloids, you have the news, and now, up to now, say, so from the 80s, 90s up to now, we have social media, and how quickly a word can get out over globally on social media. That's one. And two, media with regards to quote unquote glamorizing, say, TV shows of what a gang member might be. You've got programs, say, for the UK here, like Top Boy.
Yeah.
Youth watch that show and go, I want to be like that. Not so much I want to be an actor on a TV show or a film. but that's a lifestyle that I can see myself in because I'm in that lifestyle right now.
Correct.
So the two parts.
Well, number one, I want to stop this idea that media is pervasive in a way that is particularly unique to technology. So I think that the first question that you ask is like, how has new social medias arisen and affected those perpetuating those stereotypes, et cetera? That would be the apparatus, right? So the apparatus is a tool that can be used by anyone. That means that people who benefit from keeping a certain narrative of people of color or people of poverty looking a certain way because it profits them will, of course, use the same internet, Beyonce's internet, that someone like myself or Raphael or Adam or Malik may use to get our narrative out there and shape how we believe the world should look like. So I think the thing about technology is that it doesn't have ethics. Technology does not have a natural proclivity towards something just. It simply is in existence. And I think we get to arguing about what it is and the nature of it when truly we need to be looking at the human, right? Because the human is going to decide what the apparatus does. That's number one. So if you have more humans that have more humanity in what they express and how they express and are more objective and interrogate the systems that we're in, you'll have more art such as that. That's why you have the 70s having such beautiful filmmaking and reforming how ideas of cinema operates. And that's why you have like the 70s. I'm a black person, so seeing more people of my background, both proletariat and of color, through Shaft and all these people that like may have perpetuated some terrible stereotypes, but at the end of the day, it was the first time I'd seen anybody of color look like me on screen. We had a discussion the other night about how having David Oyelowo and Chiwetel Ejiofor play in a Shakespearean play and wear dreads was so revolutionary at the time. These things do matter. Do I think that they are the base of the movement? No, but they are the voice. I think the base of the movement we've discussed today are structural changes, things like that, but media can help. So to the second thing, is a question that I'm glad you asked because I have somebody from Top Boy in the audience today, Ashley Thomas, a wonderful actor. What's up, Ash? And we often get into discussions about being people from these communities that are being portrayed and what is our ethical grappling between portraying these negative images versus like, making enough money to move my family out of the environment that we were talking about on screen. And for me, the answer is always this. Am I telling a truth for people who do not know the truth exists so that they can have empathy for the people in that truth? Or am I just profiting off of the romanticization of what the thing is? Is that a fetish or is it fundamentally changing how people look at these people? If it does the first, I'm gonna participate. The reason I appreciate Snowfall, my mentor John Singleton and Eric Amadio, created a show hoping to expose how the crack epidemic happened. Not just, hey, look, crack was what it was. We selling drugs, making money, and that's it, right? Which in itself, if you are showing the truth and reality of something versus what people think it is, I think there is merit in that. And that's why I did Snowfall. I still go, we selling crack on television. And that's why I do the community work I do with my money. That's my 10%. I'm no longer just giving money to the institution of church. I go give it to the community of the kids who are incarcerated. With the Power series, I've struggled with it even more. But Raising Canaan specifically, my show, is once again showing the struggles of a family within the confines of this economic process of drug dealing, which is showing how it is tearing the family apart. So in itself, it is a bit of a parable or a tale, as Jesus would do on Mount Sermon, whether you believe in Jesus or not, but he would tell these stories to give people cautionary tales. And I think there is merit in that. Do I believe that it completely absolves me from people being like, yeah, selling crack was fun? No. But it is something that I struggle with, and I try my best to be honest and be true in what I'm doing and hopefully advocate for people to do things or show people that what you're looking at may not be exactly what you think it is, like he did with The Prisoner, who people have this idea of this big kingpin when really he's just somebody's son. And to land that point, my uncle was Stanley Tookie Williams. He was incarcerated in San Quentin, one of the worst prisons in the world. And he's known as the founder of the Crips in Los Angeles. What people don't know is that he was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And something he created as a youth program to protect his neighborhood was turned into this poster child for gang hoodlumism around the world. People don't know he's a 2-time Nobel laureate for anti-gang activism. So people don't know he's the son of a mother who was the first in her family of 14 from the Deep South to graduate from college who she to this day, she's probably watching this and praying over all of us right now. So like, he was a smart child, he was a brilliant child, he was empathetic. His empathy would cause him to create a band of people to protect himself from these structural issues, the racist police, older people who were victimized by the war previously, who had drug-addled minds, who were robbing children, robbing women. He sought to protect himself from his community. He truly was an activist. He wasn't a gang member. He was a guy who started a group of friends trying to protect each other, and it got out of hand, right? And I think that exposing, if someone told a story about that, told a narrative about that, a Netflix doc about that, a book about that, that's of merit. People may be interested because of the fetishization and bastardization of those terminologies, but when they get there, the contents of it is humanity. And I think that's where the merit is, and I think that's where media and technology can come and help. That's my answer.
I just wanted to, thank you so much, Malcolm. I just wanted to offer 2 small points about this, only because we talk about it in our book, Brick by Brick, in our chapter on propaganda. So I want to say 2 things. One, and this is not to you personally, but this is to the room. There is so much inherent anti-blackness in the way that shows featuring black casts are viewed and understood. When I watch Top Boy, I'm not watching a crime show. I'm watching a show about the vulnerability and emotions of young black men in London. That's what I see when I watch Top Boy. I don't see the glorification of drugs. I see young men who are in an economic position where the only product that they have to sell, the only institution that will give them capital to allow them to start a business, it's not a bank, it's not a small business loan, it's not a VC investor.
It's the plug.
It's the plug who's going to front them with a certain amount of product, which they can then go sell and make a living for themselves. And the reason I say this is the framing and the way that we view things is so, so, so important. And that we have to recognize the stereotypes that we've been indoctrinated with living in a white supremacist society. And because I've never heard anyone say Breaking Bad glorifies making meth.
Talk about it. Talk about it.
Never heard that, ever. Everyone's, well, like, Walt, he's got cancer, you know, his wife, his kids. I'm like, oh, he's a human being.
Empathy, huh?
Interesting. Oh, Walt shouldn't go to prison. I mean, he only did it for, oh my gosh, now we can empathize with people who break the law. So interesting.
Jesse was a slave.
Right.
Jesse was a slave.
So I just want to say that the way that we engage with a lot of crime media is filtered through very racist lens and racist stereotypes. But the other side of that, and to bring it back to the chapter point, the media that we really need to be critical of is the media that glorifies state-sponsored violence. We need to be concerned that on Law and Order SVU, you watch officers abuse, beat, violate every human right of someone, and then the framing of the show gets you to cheer for them as they do it. We should be concerned about shows which portray our criminal justice system in a way that's untrue. Or the fact that the vast majority of people charged with a crime never go to trial and are never judged by a jury of their peers. And so a lot of the falsities and the propaganda we believe about the criminal justice system comes from the media that we absorb. And the other thing that I would just ask is challenge your local and independent news media to challenge the narratives given to them directly by state agencies and by police officers and by state representatives. Because we cannot just be, our media shouldn't just be a mouthpiece. We need investigative journalism.
Correct.
We need people pushing back and asking challenging questions. We need those who are looking into the allocation of our state funds and those other types of things. And so I just use this media question as a way to say we do have power as well in the media that we consume and our choices in terms of supporting independent and local media.
Because your attention is dollars, your money is dollars. Go watch this.
I know I have one point here, and then I want to make sure we try and get a few more questions.
Very, very small thing, about social media. I know people say lots of nice things about social media. I'm a bit more cynical. I don't think social media is an empty vessel for which we can pour whatever kinds of political projects we wish into them. There's a really great book by a guy called Richard Seymour called The Twittering Machine. And in it, he describes social media. He says calling social media is a bit like calling cigarettes conversation sticks. But most people, that's kind of how we use them, right? They're sticks we hold in our hands, we have a chat with someone, it's a kind of social thing, that's how we start smoking generally. It's a stick we hold in our hand to socialize and have a conversation. But it's not their primary purpose. The primary purpose of cigarettes is to for them to be very, very addictive, so you purchase more cigarettes and generate income for the tobacco companies. It is the exact same thing with social media. The purpose of social media is not to be sociable. It is to release endorphins in you when you see that little click, when you see that little notification come up, and so you click more. Or, so when you see something that infuriates you, you comment. Or when you see something that you really agree with, you comment. They require scandal, they require, therefore, engagement. That is the purpose of social media. That's why the far-right fascists are so good at it. So I think we need to think very carefully and act with caution when we engage with so-called social media.
Let's get this, you know. Over here? Yeah, this side's right. We're going to get to you, Blue Mama. I love you. We're going to get over to some people.
Hi, thanks so much for the panel, by the way. It was really enlightening. I was just wondering if any of you had any thoughts on the psychiatric system and non-psychiatric institutions as, you know, from an abolitionist context, as aspects of the prison industrial complex, given that, you know, so many people, many of them really marginalized, can be detained against their will in psychiatric wards, and that this is the case, you know, in the US and in this country and across the world.
Have you been put in psychiatric?
As an abolitionist, I will just nab this question.
5150.
Two things. So one, that we're here talking about race. The intersections of race and psychiatric treatment in the UK are abhorrent. I ask you tonight to look up the amount of black men who are detained right now today under a 136 order. I ask you right now to look up today that the British police can see someone who's in a state of being mentally unwell and kidnap that person, take them as far away from their home county as they like to be, and take them to what's called a place of safety, like Charing Cross Police Station, where we know multiple people have been beaten and abused and all these other things happen. But Charing Cross Police Station is a place of safety where you can take someone in the middle of a mental breakdown. And so we really have to examine the ways that mental health is used to control and dehumanize people, from the history of and how intertwined it is with misogyny in this country, from the use of hysteria to mass, sterilize and institutionalize women who rejected patriarchy in their families. So many ways that, particularly in British history, that psychiatry and control and quite frankly, death by science have been used throughout history. So I just want to say that as an abolitionist, we do stand for the abolition of psychiatric institutions. I won't speak for anyone else, but I would say my collective and cradle community, that we view institutions where people are held against their will, where they're medicated against their will. Yeah. We view those as the same violations of their human rights in many ways. And also that in women's prisons in the UK, psychiatric medication is given overwhelmingly, particularly to women and transgender people and LGBTQ people in prisons in this country. And you can be prescribed antidepressants and other types of sedatives without ever seeing a doctor, without ever being examined by a psychiatrist. And I'm getting emotional because these things are unacceptable, and they happen right now today with our tax dollars and in our names. And so I will say that we do stand against psychiatric institutions, and that's not to say that people don't need mental health care. That's not to say that we don't need places where people can be separated from the rest of the community in order to seek treatment. Those two things are not the same. And Broadmoor should close right now, today.
Thanks to the panel. I just really wanted to appreciate the historical context that you gave, Adam, around policing as an institution, right, and its intent, and to give a sort of example from South Africa. The first school you have in the Cape is the Dutch East India Company, because they don't know what to do with black kids who aren't old enough to work yet, right, as slaves. So when we speak about things like education and policing as if they're these neutral institutions that don't have this racist political intent, right? What does that then mean? And so one of my favorite abolitionists, Ruthie Gilmore, she describes racial capitalism as technologies of anti-relationality. And I think that's so important from what we've been hearing, because at some point we have to reckon with the fact that these solutions of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can also be a lawyer, you can also be a black capitalist, the Reverend Jesse Jackson thing, it's still the same part of that pathologization, because it is about collectives, it is about relationality, and this type of liberal individualization, like I made a choice, I could do it, takes away from the structural oppression that people go through. And the fact that as black people in black communities, we don't need to be told, we don't need research, we don't need to see a black person of excellence to know black people can think, to know black men are capable of love, to know that they're not inherently violent. So who is that messaging for? Who are these NGOs for? Who is this research for? When that's something we know in our core, we want to deal with the structural constraints that have made people think that that is worthy of a research project, that black men can love, that they're not violent by nature. We know that as black people. And I think being in the academy, being in the university, something we haven't spoken enough about is how the discursive frames that we use, the very concepts of the Western social sciences, of modernity, are also interpolated in that type of racialized logic. So all these questions that we ask, students say they want free education, we say, well, who's going to pay for it? Right? Or abolish prisons. Well, what do you do with crime? I think what we suffer from is a crisis of imagination, right? And the real core of reimagining, the real core of creating different futures, I think what abolition is invested in and what we should spend most of our time trying to prefigure is how do we create institutions and structures based in things that we know exist, like love, like care, like, you know,
well, that's beautiful.
The black family, etc.
That's beautiful. I don't know what the question was, but I'm gonna tell you this. You are right. You know, this is gonna be the last thing I say, because I know we all gotta get up out of here. But for me personally, I was gonna start this segment off initially by saying I kind of feel like we're a part of a problem here, right? Everyone in this room and everyone on this panel is unfortunately a distraction. Right? We are the individual. We are the, what did you tell me yesterday at dinner? Selective selection, something. It was smart because she's smart. And basically where you have individuals who have been heralded in front of media to prove that, hey, look, they did it. You know, we made it. And there's a tokenism to it, and I think it's almost even far more conspicuous. It's this thing where, you know, my parole officer used to call me the boy who lived. And because my particular area in a particular time, there was more deaths than the first tour of Fallujah, murders, homicides, in our particular space in Los Angeles at a certain period of time. And I'm not talking about over history, I'm talking about for 2003 to 2006. And I remember feeling like my entire building, everyone who was my age had passed away from murder and homicide, not in their sleep, and except me. And I've stood here in the face of every one of these societal ills that we're speaking of, whether it was from, you know, socially being stratified, economic dissonance, lack of resource, broken family, broken homes, drugs, gangs, and the whole cocktail of fuckery that systems have perpetuated onto our communities. And I stand here as someone who's been successful, in nice clothes, got minimal scars on. Well, I got some, you got one too. And, you know, I'm on this nice panel at this institution, and I'm often you know, most people clap at the end of that, oh my God, he survived all these things, and he's successful, and you worked with all these people, and you've done all these things. And I go, but that's the sad part. That's the problem, right? The problem is that I am the boy who lived, and there is no one else. I don't have anyone to relate to. I don't have anybody to have community with. These are the few instances in which I feel community that you speak of, that we need to fight the collective, because I and myself am a symbol of the issue. To have normal health care, to have psychiatric proper resources, not just incarceration in another form with the name psychiatric help on it. to have reformative justice, to have proper means towards an education, a proper education, a good education, where my tax dollars go to work for somebody actually learning how to articulate, read, and write before the age of 5, right, or 6, or 7, or 8. So to have opportunities at jobs that can change the situation economically for my family, or just give us peace and solidarity and a nice community. It should be normal. It should be, as you said, a no-brainer. I should not exist. I wish I wasn't special. My circumstance of survival should not make me a unique product. The product should be that we are all a byproduct of positivity and harmony, and it should be odd to us when somebody's parent has abandoned them, right? It should be odd to us when someone is riddled by drugs and not getting the care they deserve, or falsely classified as a criminal when they were a juvenile who committed something to protect themselves and may have committed murder, been convicted, but it was protection, and not judge that as someone who's out here committing a serial amounts of crime, and not put them in the same cell as my situation was. I shouldn't be an anomaly. He shouldn't be an anomaly. She shouldn't be an anomaly. He shouldn't be an anomaly. Ola shouldn't be an anomaly. This should be the normative. And we should be having a communal conversation where everybody got mics. And that is my dream, and that is my hope, and that's where I stand in unison, in harmony with you. That is what I would like, for people to stop looking at me like, oh my, good, you're so special. I would like to not be special anymore. I would like to not be the only one that lived. I'd like for all of us to live. And that's my personal mandate and mission. So.
I suppose my closing remarks would be, I'm tired of being invited to lots of corporate events to inspire and motivate people who don't need inspiration. They really don't need motivation. And I try and turn those conversations around by asking them to go out there and inspire the people who do need inspiration, who do need motivation, because there is no one in their corner. I'm talking about, next week I'm going to give a talk to JP Morgan, one of the big companies, middle management, who want me to come and give them a motivational talk in order to inspire them to get through next year. But what they're asking me to do is to come and share my sad experience of being wrongfully imprisoned and brutalized, so they feel good about themselves. And I get it. I do get it, because I've done it for years.
And we're going to take that money.
to pay my mortgage and buy the things that I need in life. But when I do sit and stand in front of those groups of people, I do try and use those opportunities to motivate them in a different way, not just to make them feel good about themselves, but to try and get them to sign up to something where they can, like I said with the shoe sniff opportunity, get them to do something. That for me is rewarding. Malcolm asked me when I first came in, you know, where do you decompress after you go into these environments where I hear and see and experience the saddest things in life, as if I've not had enough of that in my own life. It's as if I'm addicted to it. Well, how do I decompress? And often in talks I talk about, when I was in prison, I'd take a shower, and every drop of water would take away the pain from that day. Every water that dropped off my shoulder, my head, my body, and hit the floor, that was the suffering of today, and the negativity and the hope was all hitting the floor. Tomorrow's going to be a new day, a fresh day. And I use that again and again and again. And I use it also when I come out of these godforsaken places that I go in to document the life of people in prison. When I finish and I get back to a very nice 4- or 5-star hotel paid for by Netflix,
Amen,
insisted by me, I take that shower and I wash away all the stories, all the smells, all the experiences, but it never really leaves me, which is what inspires me to do the foundation that I set up to try and improve humanity, or give people their basic human rights. So my final words are really about, what does inspiration and motivation really mean? How do we motivate and inspire? Who do we motivate and inspire? And how can we work together? I leave rooms like this saying, thank you, well done, everybody. And if I'm lucky, 1 or 2 will connect with me on Instagram saying, loved your talk today, Raphael, that's it. But we need to work together more. We need to connect more. Why can't I connect with every one of you in this room? I'm approachable, Malcolm, everybody else here, Chelsea, Adam, Malik, everybody else is approachable. And we're thinking from the same thoughts. We want to do the same thing, not always in the same way or in the same direction, and we might be miles apart, but just that connection is one of the things I always try and leave an audience with. We need to connect. I'm here, you're here, we want to do something. I want to help you, you want to help me, we want to help them, we want to stop them and do lots of things. We've got to do it together. Collectively, we are a force. Individually, it's difficult, it's tough. And even though I have a huge platform in Netflix, I have a huge opportunity to share the insights and the experiences. It's still a lonely journey. It's still a difficult journey. But together we can make, I think, changes. Whatever your experiences are, whether you've got a PhD or you're a recent graduate like me or you have this amazing experience, whatever your work is, I think collectively, as we know, we can make a difference. Individually, we can make a difference.
Gang
It's
shit.
your choice. Thank you.
Gang shit. Go ahead, Rob. Go ahead, get out.
But I'm going to break away because I've got to thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
My butt hurts. Oh, we not leaving? Oh, okay. My bad. I thought we was leaving. All right.
I do some of that corporate stuff as well.
We have about
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the part where you were talking, especially about the kind of imperial legacies in policing in the UK. And I was wondering, especially since people often talk about other European countries as having these like exceptionally humane prisons, that's something I'm a little critical of, especially given that those other European countries are also colonizers themselves. So I was wondering if you could possibly talk a little bit about the colonial legacies in countries with these like magnificent model prisons and how perhaps they also exhibit colonial legacies.
Ooh, I love this question. Wow. Where to start? Let's start with the Netherlands. People always talk about prisons in the Netherlands where most incarcerated people don't wear like a
uniform identification.
Like a uniform. They don't have a number of identification. They're referred to as their name. And the Netherlands also has open prisons where people, for a certain amount of days in the week, they will go, to work in the local community and they come back to the prison at a certain time, like a curfew.
Furlough days.
Okay, so the Netherlands previously colonized Suriname, and the Surinamese people are so overwhelmingly represented in the Netherlands immigration system that just in the past 10 years, they've built 2 to 3 new immigration detention facilities. You should know that the same company that runs most private prisons and services many private prisons, Sodexo here in the UK, they run those immigration detention facilities. The same Sodexo that ran the Trump children on the border detention facilities, those same ones, it's the same.
Also run the asylum system here, and all the asylum seekers vouchers that they get for food is Sodexo.
And they also do some border stuff where there's a conflict going on right now. So if you're interested in the relationship of Sodexo with a lot of European countries in there, just go and look at the countries that Sodexo works in. And that, for one, will give you a good spread. But particularly in Norway, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, where this idea of this paternalist like prison environment where it's really focused on rehabilitation, those prisons are overwhelmingly white and no one who has immigration status is permitted to use those prisons. So it's very clear that the new liberal, this prison is better, is for people of a certain background. And that highlights the history of even when prisons first went to the United States. The first penitentiary in the US was in Philadelphia, and it was only for white British subjects. Even Irish people weren't permitted into the first penitentiary. So there's levels to that. And the only other thing I'll say about it is like the British have led the world in terms of criminal justice. We led the world in terms of the violence, the corporal punishment, the means of executions, the liberal reforms to those executions, which the penitentiary was one of them, right? And so I think it's very important to say here that Britain did lead the world in crafting prisons, in crafting mental health, in crafting many of the systems that exist now today. And now I'd love to hear what Adam has to say about this question.
So I guess maybe there's two or three things. The first, of course, is that, interestingly, prison abolition, the first people to begin to talk about prison abolition in this kind of way, actually emerged from Northern Europe. So it's people who are engaging with this so-called idealist kind of prison system that begin to say, okay, this isn't working. This is clearly not working. There's a problem here. It emerges from the experimentation with this so-called progressive restorative justice-y type of system that the ideas of prison abolition begin to be articulated. So I think that's a really important thing to consider first and foremost. I think the second thing that's really important is that, of course, many of these Northern European countries, the Netherlands is, I think maybe it's more difficult for them to do it because they have post-colonial migrant populations that kind of remind them that they were an empire. But of course, like the Swedish-Norwegian Empire, right, had slave colonies across the Caribbean. What's now the U.S. Virgin Islands, right? They just sold them to the United States when slavery was formally abolished because it wasn't as profitable anymore. And so I think this is a really important way of thinking about the ways in which these kinds of colonial legacies can often be, whitewashed in significant ways. But I think the third thing, crucially, is that we have to think about capitalism as well as racism, right? We have to think about the class system and the way that, we've already mentioned a number of times, we consistently see lower income people, poorer people, the working classes, the proletariat, as has been pointed out, not simply as the people who are targeted by the police, but by the people for whom, even if there was no prejudiced police officer and every police officer had all the kind of training and proper. What do they call it these days? What's the fancy word they call it?
Community policing?
Community. Oh no, it's even more fancy than that. It's called unconscious bias training.
Oh,
Even if an unconscious bias trainer had gone into their mind and surgically removed the prejudice,
right.
And so they were cleansed of all of the horrible bigotry within their minds, by enforcing the law as it exists, they would still have to reproduce the class system. They would still have to reproduce the racial hierarchies as they exist, right? And that exists. That is a planetary problem, right, that we have to be dealing with, right? And so while racism can provide a certain form of rationality for these systems, right, the economic basis for that racial rationality remains capitalism, right? And so I think if we see the interconnections between these different imprisoned systems across different parts of Europe and different parts of the world, which utilize race and class in different ways, in different kinds of contexts, we can join up these struggles for abolition, right, which exist as prominently in Northern Europe, where everything is hunky-dory, as they do in places like the United States and South Africa, where everything very overtly is not.
Yeah, money didn't solve that issue for us either.
Okay, so we are at 6 o'clock, so I can get a round of applause. Oh, sorry, can we get a round of applause? I guess. Can I say?
Appreciate y'all. Love y'all. This is about y'all.
I would just say write to someone in prison, because people in prison are disappeared. And the whole purpose of this space and of being an abolitionist is not just to talk about people in prisons, but to connect with people in prisons, organize with people in prisons, send resources. You can organize with comrades if you do mutual aid, if you have local things going on, if you're working with your local community. As a student at Oxford, I started a reading group with a local prison. If you're a student here, if you're doing research here and you engage with prisoners, pay them for their perspectives, co-write articles with prisoners, create art, create things, publish things with their names on it, engage, and do not forget of those who are locked inside, because they're human beings just like me and you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, appreciate you.
Thank you, man.
Let me take this shit off.
Appreciate it, brother.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you.
It's come a long way to enlighten us. And even like the gang culture stuff you were talking about, something occurred to me when you were saying it. My research is about kinship networks.